Okay, we'll get underway. Well, good afternoon, everyone. If we could could we just stop talking? Hello. We'll just get underway. I'm very conscious that at yesterday's Auckland session we ran short of time, and we've got more people here today. We had 4 hours yesterday, and we did run short of time. But welcome to today's Transmission Pricing Methodology Second Issues paper. My name is John Rampton, and I'm the General Manager of the Market Design Team here at the Authority. The Market Design Team is the team that's been responsible for the Transmission and Pricing Methodological Review, and indeed, in accordance with that responsibility, we're responsible for developing the Second Issues paper, which is the topic under discussion today. Now look, before I get underway, I have to just cover a couple of administrative matters. Obviously, with the new health and safety legislation, I have to be very mindful, and the onus is on me actually to cover safety-related matters. It's reasonably brief, unlike yesterday. It's only about a couple of steps. So the main thing to do is if there is alarm or is there an indication, you have to leave through the exits, which are clearly marked, and the congregation space for this building is in front of, now I may pronounce this incorrectly, but it's Whariwaka. It's in front of the building to the south. In any event. That's the first bit of, administrative matters I have to raise. The second point is, and I'm sure it's obvious to many of you, that we are recording this session. We have a video recorder up there, and that'll be, I understand, Alistair, it's being available on YouTube at some stage after this event. As are all the workshops actually. We're having one in Auckland, we've had one in Auckland yesterday, this one in Wellington today, we've got one in Invercargill tomorrow and Christchurch on Friday. All of those are available on the net. We will send out the links to the workshops. So that means that if you have a question to raise, please just raise your hand. Sultanat over there in the red shirt will come around and bring you the microphone. Please state your name and affiliation and speak into the microphone because that assists in the recording. Likewise, we will also be responding to any questions through the microphone as well. I know sometimes that we can break down a bit, but we'll try as much as possible to stick to that approach. Now, Sultanat's just informed me that we're having coffee. We're breaking for coffee at 3 o'clock, and that's correct, Sultanat? And it'll probably have about half an hour given the amount of people here to have a bit of a coffee break, or a tea break of course, and then we'll get underway again at 3:30. We are planning to finish here at 5, and we probably would like to wrap up around about that time. So what's the purpose of today's workshop? Well, I think it's very clear, it's indicated in the slide. It's for parties to gain a better understanding of our TPM Second Issues paper, which was released a month or so ago. This will help you and assist you make informed submissions. So accordingly, I really encourage you to ask lots of questions today, explore issues. Our intention is we'd like to make this a very interactive session. I think it'd be fair to say we were very pleased with how the session went yesterday. There was a lot of questions from people up in Auckland, very good questions that we were able to answer and assist people understand the proposal to help them make informed submissions. Now obviously in terms of the presentation today is obviously informed by the TPM Second Issues paper, but we've also put some emphasis and tailored it to a certain extent to some of the comments and feedback I suppose we've got back from the one-on-one meetings we've had to date with a number of parties. So there is a bit of an emphasis and tailoring to reflect matters that have come up, because we think they are the sort of matters that would be useful to cover in this particular presentation as a workshop. But what I really want to emphasise, if you've got something else that you think is important that's not necessarily covered in this presentation in detail, please feel free to raise that and we'll answer it or endeavour to answer it. We've got a very good panel here, and you've got me as well, which I'll introduce them shortly. So the key points to make, I think many of you are a pretty informed audience. I think I can remember seeing many of you at the launch, so you probably know these points anyway, but I'll go through them again. This is an issues paper. It's an issues paper for guidelines, proposing new guidelines. It's not proposing the TPM itself. The guidelines in layman's terms set out what the transmission charges are and who is charged, i.e., as the name suggests, they are quite high level. The TPM itself is what Transpower has to develop. So they'll develop and they will implement the actual TPM. So how it works under the code, and this is well spelled out in, I think it's part 12 of the code, is that Transpower, so we develop the guidelines, Transpower develops the TPM consistent with those guidelines, our statutory objective, and also part 4 of the Commerce Act, and they will propose to the authority an approach which they think is consistent and pursues those 3 matters, particularly the guidelines. Then we will go through, we have to consult on that, and we will approve it if we think it is the appropriate approach that best promotes those 3 things. Okay, so in terms of the structure of today's workshop, having a number of presentations as indicated up there, or a number of presenters I should say, as indicated up there. So Alistair Dixon, who's our Principal Advisor at the Authority and the TPM subject matter expert. He's been undertaking this role now for 3 or 4 years, so he's very knowledgeable about TPM. He's also an economist, which is a good degree to have in this area. He will touch on and present on the elaboration of decision-making economic framework. He'll also talk about the problem definition. He'll cover the proposal. Then we will pass over to David Rohan, an engineer from Concept Consulting. Concept have done all the indicative modelling for us. So David will outline some of the key assumptions and also potentially, depending how we're going on time, also discuss some of the indicative results. Then we will pass over to Rowan Harris, who's adjacent to Alistair. Rowan is an economist with Oakley Greenwood in Australia, so they undertook an independent assessment of the TPM proposal in terms of the cost-benefit analysis, and Rowan will walk you through some of the key aspects of that. And next steps, also Roger, so Rowan's an economist, and the final point is to make that Roger will sort of give you our views and some of the, when I say our views, that's the authority's views on some of the, what we think are some of the magnitude and context of some of the unquantified benefits that have been identified by Oakley Greenwood in their CBA. And then finally, I'll very briefly just follow up with next steps. So that's me. Completed the introduction. I'm ready to hand over to Alistair unless there's any particular questions that someone would like to ask about those more introductory high-level comments. So if you want to ask any questions about that, please do. Otherwise, I'll just pass over to Alistair who'll go through the substance of the material. Fantastic. Okay, just watch that.
Thanks, John. Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, so what I'm first going to talk about is the decision-making and economic framework and the elaboration of that we provided in the issues paper, and I'll try and go through that reasonably quickly so that we can get on to the proposal itself. So you'll all be familiar with our decision-making and economic framework, which gives a preference to market-based approaches, and if market-based approaches aren't efficient, practicable, comply with the code amendment principles and cover the full costs, then we'd consider administrative approaches. And so we have developed our proposal on the basis using this framework, but we've been further guided by an elaboration of the framework, which we've outlined in the second issues paper. So as is outlined in the paper, the elaboration is that based on 2 key principles. So the first of those principles is that prices should be service-based. So the cost of services is charged only to those receiving the service, and if a party is receiving higher levels of service, then their charges would correspondingly be higher. Similarly, the prices should be cost reflective, so the prices reflect the cost of delivery of service. So it means that parties getting a service improvements from the upgrades should pay the full cost of the upgrade, and so ensures that their decisions factor in those costs and encourage efficient timing and location of transmission investment. The second key principle is, and other investments. The second key principle is for shared services, parties should be charged between incremental cost and standalone cost. So this is just the classic the classic requirement to ensure that there are no cross subsidies, and that already applies in relation to connection services. Okay, I'll try pushing it hard. There we go. So in the case of connection services, users face the short-run marginal cost of using the connection through nodal prices. They're facing those short-run marginal costs, which are the cost of losses and the cost of constraints. When their use of the asset is approaching capacity, they will rationally self-ration until an increase in the capacity is justified. They will also co-optimise the connection, the investment in the connection asset, and in other investment. And so therefore they will support upgrades when the benefit of the upgrade exceeds its cost. And so we used this situation, these characteristics of connection services to help guide us in thinking, well, how might you apply charges deeper in the grid? So when thinking about interconnected grid services, so what we mean by that is those grid services beyond the boundary of connection assets, so that's the AC grid and also the HVDC link, then nodal prices do encourage efficient use, including the short-run marginal cost. But to encourage efficient investment, you should charge users collectively the cost of the upgrade, so it should be cost reflective, and you should charge in ways that don't undermine nodal prices by altering incentives for use. And then share costs among users in proportion to their share of benefits, so that means it's service-based. And the result is users have skin in the game and they have an incentive to use the interconnected grid when benefits exceed the cost of the use. It means they also have incentives to locate generation, investments in generation and load where their overall costs are minimised, and that they advocate for an upgrade when the benefit, including the reduction in nodal prices, exceeds the costs, or they would resist an upgrade when vice versa applies. Okay, so is there any questions on that elaboration? Yes?
Mike Brown from Crow Ward. I've read both the TTM and the GGPP. You've separated them. Just applying that model, how can you be sure fixing TTM is going to produce the best long-term benefit for consumers in both transmission and non-transmission?
So I mean, when we're thinking, so what firstly we're thinking, well, this framework is all about how should you be charged. When you're thinking about this is thinking about what are the principles we should use for calculating charges. And so I think it's important to distinguish between transmission and non-transmission. One thing that you do have with transmission that you don't have with non-transmission is nodal pricing. So that's providing that efficient incentives for use in terms of pricing of losses and constraints. You don't have nodal pricing in the non-transmission network. So that's an important point, I guess. But we do think these principles should apply to both to transmission and to non-transmission.
Is one market or two?
I'm not sure. I mean, we're thinking. I mean, it is overall. It's a single market. It's a single electricity market, sure. So all users, we'd expect the price signals through transmission charges to flow down to end users, and so and that's to ensure that they have efficient incentives to use the grid and to make investment decisions. Just one moment. Next time somebody asks a question, can we just wait until you get the microphone, and we'll bring the microphone down. Okay.
Can I just make clarification, Alistair? So this, I should have possibly mentioned this at the outset. This session workshop today is on the TPM, not the DGPP. We're not having a workshop on the DGPP. I know you raised the issue there, but we are very happy to meet with any party that requests to discuss the DGPP proposal and the assumptions around that, including the cost-benefit analysis. So we can cover those points in a separate meeting if you'd like.
Any other questions? Okay, so we'll move on to the problem definition. There we go. All right, press hard is the key, and I have to get harder pressing. Right, so problem definition. So we've assessed that the connection charge is market-like, so it is providing service-based and cost-reflective pricing. But we don't consider that the interconnection and HVDC charges are service-based nor cost-reflective. And the paper, as you may have managed to read it by now, provides a number of reasons why we don't think that's the case. Here I'm just discussing a couple of examples. So the first of those is that under service-based and cost-reflective pricing, you'd expect lower charges for load near the generation. But you'll see that this distribution in the interconnection charge, which is on load, is quite variable, quite a patchwork quilt across the grid, and doesn't necessarily reflect proximity to generation. So we've mentioned, if you consider consumers in the far north versus those in Waitaki and Taranaki, you are getting quite different charges. I mean, another example would be the situation of, say, Electricity Ashburton and Orion. They're adjacent networks. Certainly Orion has Christchurch, but really in terms of proximity to generation, there's not a huge difference. You're getting quite different charges. So we're not really seeing service-based and cost-reflective pricing through the existing interconnection charge. The second example is that is in relation to the payments in relation to investments. So customers have paid for investments that they or their customers don't benefit from significantly. And we put this table in the options working paper, and pointing out that there's been a significant level of investment, for example, in the Upper North Island since 2004. But in terms of charges, it's actually a relatively small proportion of the actual revenue requirement. So, and where areas where there hasn't been investment, such as the Upper South Island, their charges are actually substantially in excess of the revenue requirement in relation to the investments for that area. So were there any questions on the, in fact I've got one more slide on the problem definition. Oh, sorry.
I like to have your clarifications on the definitions of cost reflectivity.
Yeah.
The asset values that I see over there are practically post 2004 to present date. They are the investment that have been made. Are you talking about cost reflectivity of historical assets, the ones that have already been expanded? Or are you talking about a forward-looking calculations of the future cost of upgrade? So my name is Thang Nguyen from Morrison Low of Sydney, and my understanding is we've made those investments and we have reached a situation where we would have significant excess capacity in the system, and therefore there is a consideration that the regional coincident peak demand, which is a very common measure that's been used in other jurisdictions in Australia and in the UK, as a measure of the future requirement for upgrades. And therefore, we have had regulations which are based on the calculation of long-run marginal costs, which are mainly forward-looking investment.
So I think there's actually, so I think it's both. So So yes, in terms of future investment, what we're talking about is charges that take into account the cost of that future investment. But it is also a relevant consideration for historical investment, because then that raises that question of, are the charges between incremental and standalone cost? So in terms of historical, when you're looking here, there's the question of, are these charges, this does raise the question of whether the charges are between incremental and standalone costs, given the sort of the potentially anomalous charges. Roger, you want to answer that?
This table is making a very simple point, and the simple point is that some areas have had big increases in investment, and the users in those areas have not paid all the costs of that investment, so it's not cost reflective, and likewise other users in the other three areas in particular have had less investment, like the bottom two areas I think it is, have had less investment, and they have been paying more than the cost of that investment. So the charges are not cost reflective.
I appreciate that, but your definition of...
Sorry, I don't think your microphone's... Can you just check there?
I understand that, but that would be reflectivity of historical cost, and we don't see the tabulation of future upgrade costs, and so the question is, are we using primarily the area of base charges to recover historical costs, the money which obviously the recovery of which are not necessarily very good price signals in economic efficiency terms?
I think Alistair will come to that later in the
I think we will address
presentation.
yeah.
But the point is, in 2004, these weren't historical costs, and people have not paid for them as if in a service-based and cost-reflective way.
And in the context of the CBA, the modelling is primarily around forward-looking costs. So it compares the forward-looking costs of the transmission network relative to alternatives to transmission. So that's one of the key benefits that we're looking at, but it's very much forward-looking in that sense. But Alistair's also right, how you recover historic costs, sunk investments, is also important, because the way you do that could distort consumption behaviour or investment behaviour. So the RCPD price signal is effectively doing that, because you're using a variable price signal to recover a sunk investment. So customers or DBs are responding to that price signal, so they're changing their investment behaviour, but it may not necessarily be changing the costs, because it's primarily designed to recover sunk costs.
Yeah.
Shane Adams, Trustpower. If you could go back to your prior slide, Alistair. Press hard, yeah. I noticed there on the right, your map has effectively divided costs by a denominator of megawatt hours being energy.
Yep.
Surely there's a view that you could have taken which says, well, these customers are not actually buying energy, they're buying peak capacity. That's what the grid's built to deliver.
Sure.
So if you divided their costs by megawatts instead of megawatt hours, what would that map have looked like, and would it have been a problem?
Are you able to answer that, David? We probably, I mean, we could, I mean, I think, yeah, I'm not, I mean, I think, yeah, I don't know. I think that's something we'd have to have a think about and come back to you, Shane, I think. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Okay, so I guess from what our perspective on the problem definition is that interconnection and HVDC charges both cause inefficiency, and we think this is in two ways. So they encourage inefficient use of the grid when there's no congestion. So the charges are based on use of the grid, as we've discussed, regional coincident peak demand and mean injection with respect to the HVDC charge, and that encourages inefficient use of demand response and distributed generation. The effect of the current charging is that after there's been grid investment, the rate of the charge increases, and that increases the incentives to avoid use of the grid, which is inefficient when there is spare capacity. We also think that the charges encourage inefficient investment. So when there's incentives for inefficient use, that's driving investment, and therefore that drives inefficiency in that investment in the grid. In terms of the semi-based charge on South Island generators, we think that encourages generation investment in the North Island, but discourages generation investment where it may be needed in the Upper South Island. In terms of the RCPD charges, as we've discussed, we think that it provides an incentive to invest inefficiently if there's an excessive incentive to avoid use of the grid. And in terms of the postage stamp nature of the interconnection charge, that also potentially encourages inefficient investment because the beneficiaries of an investment are actually paying a relatively small proportion of the actual cost of the charge because that's borne by non-beneficiaries. Excuse me. So we also think that the TPM is not durable, so it's not service-based, it's not cost-reflective, and parties are objecting to paying for things that they don't receive a benefit from. Oh, sure. Oh, thanks, John. Okay. Now, were there any more questions on the problem definition? Okay, so the next few slides are ones that many of you have seen before, so I'll run through these as quickly as I can and get on to sort of the new material. So as we've indicated at their launch, we're proposing a change from two main current charges, which is the HVDC and interconnection charge, through to the area of benefit and the residual charge. There are slightly anomalous figures in those two under the current charges versus the new, and that's because the current charge figures are for 2015-16. The new is the modelled charges, which are a 2019, so 2019 sort of forecast. So we're proposing two new charges, and I guess the other key point is we're proposing an expansion to the prudent discount policy. Okay, perhaps if we just go straight to the main thing, and I'll just run through the key points. So we're proposing, in terms of those three main charges, the connection charge, the area of benefit charge, and the residual charge, we're proposing retaining the connection charge, except for the possible inclusion of additional components. The area of benefit charge, we're proposing that would be applied to load and generation, and it would apply to new investment, replacement, refurbishment, and upgrades. So it's all new investment. And we're proposing two methods for calculating that charge. So a standard method for investments above 5 million, which would be we're anticipating would be a granular method that would look at apply charges to all beneficiaries of an investment, and also to historical investments since 2004 above $50 million plus Pole 2. For the standard method, we would also allow optimisation of asset values for calculating the charges, and also a marginal cost adjustment, which I'll explain in a short time. And then we're also proposing that the charges could be redetermined if there was a material change of circumstance, such as the entry or exit of a major customer. And then a more simplified method, as I said, for new investments. And then the residual charge, we're proposing that would be applied to load only. We considered applying it to generation, but we think we think applying to generation would potentially just lead to pass-through into energy prices, and that would therefore potentially affect use, and may therefore result in an inefficient use. We think it's therefore better to apply it just to load. We're proposing that it would be applied in proportion to historical physical capacity, and we've suggested 3 possible ways of doing that: lines, transformer capacity, or gross anytime maximum demand. And that would be historical to avoid incentives for changing behaviour in response to the residual charge. The residual would cover costs not recovered through the area of benefit charge, and it would so that includes investments and assets, existing assets that wouldn't be covered initially by the area of benefit charge, and also unallocated operating expenses and overhead, which are a significant amount. Okay, so I think everybody would be fairly familiar with those, that broad overview. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, actually, electricity with solutions. Gross AMD seems to be quite a nebulous term.
I am going to be explaining what it is a few slides hence. So, yes. Yeah. Okay. So if you could hold your question until then, that'd be great. Okay, thank you. Okay, so just to give you an indication of the effect of the charge, so we have done this on megawatt hours, not on megawatts. So on a megawatt hour basis, the current interconnection charge, as we discussed, we think that's a patchwork quilt despite being a postage stamp. Our proposed residual charge is a much more even charge, so it is much more of a postage stamp like charge in its effect. There are a couple of areas that you can see there in the South Island that would experience relatively higher rates in dollars per megawatt hour terms, and that's because they have a relatively low load factor relative to most distributors. In terms of the area of benefit charge, the initial effect would be more charges on the Upper North Island, and that is because of the proposal to apply the charge to those large historical investments, many of which benefit the Upper North Island. Slightly higher charges for the North Island load in general because of the proposal that the HVDC would be subject to the area of benefit charge, and North Island load is one of the main beneficiaries of that. And then the overall effect, you'll see that that sort of effect of the area of benefit charge and the residual charge is sort of combined, does lead to higher charges in that Upper North Island area. And I guess one thing I'd say is the change in colour, the effect that is because a substantial proportion of the revenue is recovered through the residual charge. Okay, so as I said, the area of benefit charge would be charged to those that benefit from grid investments. So the charge is on the basis of expected benefit over the lifetime of the investment. We think the charge is service-based and cost-reflective and easy to calculate once you've got a method for calculating benefits, and that method would be determined by Transpower when it develops the TPM, and then subject to the authority approving that proposal. So it would, we think the area of benefit charge would provide net benefits because it would reduce costs to consumers of transmission services over the long term by creating incentives for transmission investment to occur only when beneficiaries are willing to pay for it. And area of benefit charges are used elsewhere, such as in the US and also in South America. Okay, so to discuss calculation of the charge to each customer is based on the share of expected positive net benefits from an investment over its expected life. So we've addressed an issue that's been raised by submitters during this review, which is that parties that are receiving in net terms negative net benefits, that was a concern that they shouldn't be subject to a charge. So if you think of something like South Island Load, where they do at times benefit from the HVDC when flows are to the south. But over the long run, you would expect flows to go to the north, and over the long run, in net terms, they would be worse off from the HVDC, because without the HVDC, prices in the South Island would be more suppressed because of the availability of generation. So we're proposing it would be expected positive net benefits. As I said, Transpower would develop the methods for estimating the net benefits, and we've identified a number in the paper, and identifying the areas of benefit. Now, what do we mean by an area of benefit? That's where at least one designated transmission customer is expected to receive a positive net benefit. So, calculation of the charge involves 4 steps. The first would be to estimate the net benefits from the investment and where they would accrue. So we'd expect that to occur when the investment, around the time of the investment proposal, so that parties who are subject to the charge know what they are likely to face in terms of a charge. Then to calculate the share of net benefits received by each area, calculate the annual revenue to be recovered in relation to the investment. So the charge to each area is the annual revenue to be recovered multiplied by their share of net benefits. So it's not their actual benefit, it's their share of net benefits. So in many cases you might expect that actually the investment would have net benefits overall. So individual customers' benefits may actually exceed the cost of the investment. So it's the revenue to be covered multiplied by their share of net benefits, and that's their charge to each area. If there's only one customer in an area, that is their charge. If there's more than one customer, the charge is proportion to their aggregate expected positive net benefit, if that can be calculated in a practicable way. But if that's not practicable, then we're proposing that within the area, the charges would be calculated on a physical capacity basis for load or annual injection for generation. And we're proposing that that capacity measure for load would be the same as used for the calculation of the residual. So I'll just provide an example, and then we could perhaps follow up with questions. So here's an example of a calculation of the area of benefit charge. So we've got an investment from generation in Area 1 to load in Area 2, and we assume that the value of the investment is $40 million and the revenue to be recovered each year is $4 million. And we'll assume that the investments, the net benefits from the investment over its lifetime are $100 million. Of which Area 1, so the generation area, receives $40 million in net benefits, and Area 2 receives $60 million. So the annual charge to Area 1 is the $4 million, so the revenue to be recovered, multiplied by their share of net benefits, which in this case is 40%. So the charge to Area 1 in total is 1.6 million, and a similar calculation for Area 2, and that gives you the charge for Area 2 is for $2.4 million. Since there's only one party in Area 2, that's Load C, that is their charge. The area benefit charge for Area 2, that's actually shared between the two generators in that area, A and B, and we'll assume that A accounts for 70% of the average injection in the year, so we're assuming that the calculation is done on average injection rather than benefit, and B accounts for 30%. So A's charge is just 70% of that share of benefits to that area, so 1.12 million, and B is 0.48 million. Okay, so are there any questions about calculation of the area of benefit charge? I'll start with Mickey. Yes.
Just clarifying, the area of benefit charge actually has a benefits allocation approach for load, but a different allocation approach for generation, because you haven't identified benefits per se.
No. So on this, in both this, what I'm assuming here in this example is that there has been an estimate of the benefit, the share of benefits, and in this example, the assumption is that that Transpower has followed its method for calculating the benefit, and that determines that there's $40 million in net benefits to generation and $60 in net benefits to load. Okay. Yep.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. Now I think it was over here. Ramu was the next one.
Hi, Ulster.
Hi, Ramu.
A question was, if one of the generators sort of retire, would the other generator pick up the full charge?
So that is a situation that might represent a material change in circumstances. I mean, that's something for Transpower to determine, but that might represent a material change. And it could also be a situation where optimisation might be appropriate as well. So it's whether, it would depend very much on the circumstance. Yep, I think it's just in the middle here.
Hi, Jonathan Suggett from Pioneer Energy. You've said a couple of times that Transpower will be charged with determining the benefits. I just would like someone to clarify what you have assumed in the cost-benefit analysis in regards to how those benefits have been derived.
In the cost-benefit analysis, I'll turn that over to Ron. Sure.
So Transpower they propose a method for determining the beneficiary approach, the area benefit approach. We approve, the authority approves that. So Transpower, as I said earlier, right at the start of this presentation, proposed a method which they think is consistent with the guidelines, the statutory objective of the authority, and also, probably of less importance, but also relevant, Part 4 of the Commerce Act. Then they proposed to the authority so the authority is the approval body. We approve that process. So I just want to make that clear.
We didn't go to the level of trying to identify the specific beneficiaries of individual future investments. So we have looked at effectively an average investment program going forward and calculated the long run marginal cost and used that as the basis for measuring whether alternatives would be incentivised. So whether DG would be incentivised as an alternative to transmission.
Could you just wait until we'll just pass you the microphone. Yep, thanks.
It's fine. So the clarification is that all the analysis is based on LRMC.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
And we'll go through.
Just to keep going on that, that's because we don't have access to an individual capital program of works that says there's a $50 million project in 2022 with these three beneficiaries split this way.
But you have a program of sunk investments which you try.
Ashley, can you just wait? We'll just bring you the microphone. Thanks.
You do have a program of sunk investments that you're trying to recover through the AOB. That's all that's been recovered in it at the moment.
Yeah, so in terms of our analysis, it's very much a forward-looking view of the investment program. So that's the primary driver in the CBA, as I said earlier on. We're looking at forward-looking investments. What's the cost of those forward-looking transmission investments? If a cost-reflective price was set for those forward-looking investments through the area of benefit charge, would that incentivise an alternative, a cheaper alternative effectively? Demand response, distributed generation, etc., etc.
James. Sofner's going to get fit today.
G'day, James Tipping, Trustpower. Just to Mickey's point before, isn't the split of charges based on average injection only if Transpower can't work out benefits to individual generators?
Exactly, yep. So I should have made that very clear, and perhaps my example wasn't such a good one. So that's the point that's made in that second, or in fact the bottom arrow. So if there's more than one customer, their share in the area, the charge to each customer is in proportion to their aggregate expected positive net benefit, unless that's not practicable to do. And there's a question of whether Transpower has the information for, to actually determine that. And that would be something that Transpower would need to consider when they're developing the TPM. Okay, any other questions about calculation of the charge? Okay. So As we've discussed, we're proposing a standard method and a simplified method for calculating the charge. And the standard method, we're saying, is it would identify and charge all beneficiaries of investments to the extent practicable. So, for example, in our modelling, we've charged not just parties. For example, if you think about an investment like the North Auckland and Northland investment, which is providing improved reliability to the North Auckland and Northland. It's also, the charges are also applying to other beneficiaries who may be receiving lower electricity prices because of reduced losses. So the idea is that the standard method would capture those sorts of benefits. The simplified method would apply to what we're calling low value investments. So our suggestion is they would be investments less than $5 million, And to the extent practicable, the simplified method needs to be simple to apply and administer, and be simple for a party to understand why they're subject to the charge. And that method would identify expected beneficiaries unless simplicity is compromised, in which case it would just be applied to customers that would receive the majority of the positive net benefit. So if you think about a small version of a NAN type investment, it might potentially just apply to those parties receiving the reliability benefits. So we'd expect the simplified method to just charge the main beneficiaries of an investment at least. Right, so any questions about the simplified method? Yes, you are.
How do you calculate the benefits for an area which may be substantially supplied by non-transmission solutions? We have actually quite a few areas where the very high DGs,
Yep.
local generation.
Sure.
And do you just, it appears that you don't account for that. You said before that you treated the supplies as a single market. So let's say there is an area where there is a 50% which is already supplied locally.
Yeah.
How do you calculate the benefits, and how do you attribute the cost and the benefits to different stakeholders?
Okay, so I'll provide an answer, and then I suspect Roger also would like to probably chip in on this one. So, I mean, the first point is that Transpower has to develop the method for determining the benefit. So we have not specified how that would be done. But you would expect in that situation that an area that is largely, there is a significant amount of self-supply, they would receive a lower benefit than an area that has less, effective self-supply through DG or perhaps demand response as well. They'd benefit less. And so our expectation would be that the charges would be lower for that area. But do you want to add anything there, Roger?
Just briefly, I agree with the answer. If the grid relied on, that area relied on the grid to provide backup services for the DG, for example, that would be a benefit of providing that backup services. But we, as Alistair said, we haven't. The grid provides a number of benefits, and we would expect Transpower to think about those when it's determining its methods, but we haven't specified method.
Right, can I just follow through with that? My point is the benefits are the same, the total benefits. If you have 10,000 customers over there, they all receive full 100% of delivery of energy, right?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
It's only the cost of the transmission grid that service that area is lower, so the net benefit is substantially higher than other areas. What I'm saying is, when you say that you're lowering the charge, that would be an incorrect response to it. You should look at the value of non-transmission solution as well. So the charges would be the same, however allocated to different forms of suppliers. That's my point.
So I don't think our proposal is inconsistent with that, because I mean, so under the TPM, non-transmission solutions would be recovered through the transmission pricing methodology as well as transmission solutions. So that's under the Commerce Act regime. The Commerce Act, provided that investment has been approved by the Commerce Commission, and that regime applies to both non-transmission solutions and transmission solutions. Okay. No other questions? Okay, so we're proposing, so the next thing is we're proposing in terms of the method used for the valuation of investments for calculating charges, we're proposing to use replacement cost to set the area of benefit charge for new investments, as well as for replacement, refurbishment and upgrades. And the reason for that is we think replacement cost better reflects the services actually provided by the asset. The effect of the replacement cost, taking a replacement cost approach, is that if replacement cost increases, then charges would rise over time, but otherwise they'd stay flat. We have, however, suggested in the paper that we're open to considering another costing basis, such as indexed historical cost, so we would welcome your feedback on that point. In terms of the charge would recover the capital cost and the cost of capital over the investment's life, but it would also include an allocation for maintenance and operating expenses. So the area of benefit charge would be similar to the connection charge, which covers all of those things. We're proposing for the existing investments that the valuation basis for determining the charges would be depreciated historical cost, and that's because under the existing transmission pricing methodology, that's the basis for determining charges, and so by taking that approach, we're avoiding double charging for any asset. We're also proposing that optimisation would be available for high value assets, so that's those above $5 million and the $50 million post-2004 investments in Pool 2. In relation to an area of benefit charge, if use has reduced significantly in relation to that investment. So for new assets, that optimisation would be available after it's been serviced for a number of years, and that period of time would be determined by Transpower, but we've suggested in the paper that be something like 10 years. And that's the reason for that is we're trying to provide an incentive for the investment to be appropriately sized, so that there isn't a benefit to parties from seeking optimisation immediately after the investment's taken place. We're also proposing that for new assets, it would be optimised to optimised replacement cost, while for existing assets, it would be optimised to optimised depreciated historical cost. Okay, so are there any questions in relation to valuation? Michael.
Mike Parker from Transpower. Can I just on the optimisation, can I
Sure.
just clarify, so if something is optimised and the value goes down, the difference between the cost and the new charges? What?
So if the value goes down, then the charges would reduce. And that would reflect that actually the demand for that in relation to that investment has reduced. So you can think of an example. Possibly an example of where there's been, say, a major customer exited. There's much less demand for the foreseeable future. In that case, it would be appropriate to consider optimisation. John.
It's clear that it won't be optimised out of the asset base. It'll just the area of benefit charge will be reduced.
Right.
So those other charges that would otherwise be recovered will be now spread across the residual.
Yeah, it'll be recovered through the residual.
So,
Thank you.
Kieran.
Hi, Kieran Murray, economist at Sapere. Alistair, the Commerce Commission looked at the valuation of investments or assets under the Part 4 and came to a different view. It came to the view that replacement cost values was only one factor that influenced asset values in workably competitive markets, and concluded that depreciated historic cost was a better indicator of the likely outcomes under long life assets with enduring relationships. Just wondering whether you looked at those arguments and you had a view about sort of why you came to a different view from the Commerce Commission.
I mean, I'm not sure if did we look at those. I think where we were coming from is really what was the sort of appropriate price signal that would be provided by the valuation method, and that's why we were proposing replacement cost. Because the disadvantage with depreciated historical cost is, of course, that, as we heard from submissions, is that initially in an asset's life, charges are very high, and then as the asset depreciates over time, charges reduce, even though perhaps over time the asset actually may be congested. So it's sort of counter to an efficient, to providing an efficient price signal. Did you want to say anything further on that, Roger?
Just to add to that, no, we didn't know about that Transpower paper, so it'd be interesting to have a look at that. But the point is that if you were buying those services in a workably competitive market, our view is you wouldn't be paying more for them after year 40 than year 1, because the services you're getting are effectively the same as the transport of electricity from one point to another.
And we heard that sort of loud and clear in submissions on the options working paper. Any other questions about valuation? Okay. So the next matter I'm going to cover is we have included a marginal cost adjustment in relation to the area of benefit charge. So the marginal cost adjustment, the reason for that is to provide an efficient price signal with respect to the area of benefit charge. So the area of benefit charge in effect does a sort of averaging of the price across all customers paying the charge rather than a marginal cost price signal. So that's why we've included that element in relation to the area of benefit charge. So under the marginal cost adjustment, Transpower would identify the customers that benefit from an investment and allocate the cost in proportion to the relative benefits as I discussed before. So what we're suggesting with the marginal cost adjustment is that pre-investment, each customer that can reduce could potentially consider whether they could reduce their demand credibly by committing to an investment. So, for example, committing to install and operate a distributed generation. Then, under the marginal cost adjustment, their charges would reduce by the marginal savings that Transpower makes. So I'll just explain that in a hypothetical example. So Transpower is proposing to install a new transformer, and that costs $10 million. And Transpower assesses that customer A has received 40% of the benefit, and its charges would be $4 million in present value terms. And then customer A installs distributed generation, which reduces their benefit to 20%. The effect of that is that that would enable Transpower to install a smaller transformer costing $9 million. So the customer charges is reduced to reflect the saving to Transpower from that change in demand. So in this case, the savings to Transpower is $1 million, so the customer's charges are reduced to $3 million. So it's sort of a slightly tricky concept to sort of explain, but that's the proposal. So were there any questions in relation to that? Jeremy?
So are you thinking of this in relation to interconnection assets or connection assets? I can see where that approach would work for connection assets, such as the example you've given here, but that's already a feature of the existing framework. Just struggling to see how it might work for an interconnection asset where they're typically sized for, not sized on the basis of the choices of individual customers.
So I think what we are saying that it could potentially apply to what are now interconnection assets, and I guess in the paper we've provided an example. I think where we've got multiple customers. So I think it is. We do think it's applicable where there are multiple customers that would benefit from an investment. And if you think of something like something like even quite large investments, a credible change from a customer could mean that there's a lower cost investment required. Does anybody want to add anything in relation to that?
At expected demand, so in this case, the expected demand would be lower because of the DG, but I think that could apply to interconnection assets as well. I don't see that would be an issue, because that would just be factored into your expected demand, which would then change your investment program going forward. And what this is trying to do is to establish what's the marginal difference in that second investment program relative to the first investment program, and to send that price signal to the end consumer.
Jeremy, we'll just give you the microphone again.
I suppose I'm just trying to figure out how this type of concept interacts with the basic TPM price signal, the new role envisaged for Transpower in relation to ACOT. It's not just DG, it's obviously broader than that. And just how it all works, and the possible introduction of an LRMC charge, and whether there's double ups or triple ups or things falling between the gaps. That's my query, and this is just because this is a new idea, and it seems to be another one of those things where we're having to make judgments potentially many years in advance of when we need to sink an investment about something which may have a very marginal effect on the actual investment cost, but could add a huge amount of complexity. So that's kind of the genesis of the query.
This would kind of operate like an LRMC-based charge that was based on the perturbation approach. So a very incremental sort of view of future investments and how they might change with a small change in demand. But I guess in this context, it's a very bespoke calculation because you're doing it for a particular investment. So, yeah.
I think,
yeah.
Marianne?
Sure. Just wondering, in the context of this, could a customer be a network company?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Rob.
Hi, Rob Allen. I don't understand that hypothetical example, and I don't understand why the customer A charge isn't $1.8 million.
I find it very difficult, Rob, to do calculations while I'm standing up here. So somebody else?
Well, 1.8 million is approximately $9 million times 20%.
Oh, to the benefit. So the situation, the reason for that is that the charge is on the marginal saving to Transpower, not to charge to that customer is on the marginal saving to Transpower, or is related to the marginal saving to Transpower, not on the benefit. So there it's the original benefit less the marginal saving. Do you want to explain that further on,
I think using this example, if absent this the marginal cost adjustment, the price signal to this business would be $2 million effectively, okay? Because it's 40%, $4 million. They go to 20%, it'd come down to $2 million. However, that means they would invest up to $2 million in an alternative. The problem is that only saves Transpower $1 million. So you're over-incentivising investment in DG if you don't make this marginal cost adjustment. That's the economic premise for it.
I understand why you want the charge to be $3 million, but I don't understand how the charge is $3 million. Under the proposal.
So that's because of the saving. So going from $4 million, which is their original charge, and that's based on that Transpower's original investment proposal, and then the customer installs the DG. So Transpower's original costs fall from $10 million to $9 million. So the marginal saving to Transpower is $1 million.
So
that's right.
Then it becomes $4 million less that marginal saving of $1 million to get the $3 million.
Yeah, I'll just work on the basis it's...
Just,
I don't understand it.
it might be even clearer if the previous comment sort of applies as well, that the Transpower actually saved nothing as a consequence of this customer installing DG. But if you charge on the average basis, the customer would still be incentivised to install DG, even though it saves Transpower nothing.
Sure.
I could see the calculations of the marginal saving difference. My proposition is that you're not treating suppliers as on equal footing. If this is not a competitive market, you assuming transmission has to be the default energy delivery. If there is a competitive market and I'm one of the competitor, why should I worry what it costs the other party to provide service? I will compete as far as I provide the cost-effective solutions to the customers. So that example doesn't provide a mimic of the competitive market operation.
I mean, my comment to that would be that the premise of the TPM is to send cost-reflective price signals, so we get efficient consumption and investment behaviour in alternatives and investment in transmission services. So in this case, this price signal is sending a cost-reflective transmission price signal at the margin, so that we get efficient investment in alternatives to transmission, like distributed generation. But DG is only invested in if the benefits outweigh the costs or the opportunity cost of the alternative.
Michael.
Sorry, did that answer your?
Sorry.
Did that answer your question or not?
Oh, sorry, could you just wait? Just hold on a moment. We'll just transfer the microphone again, sorry. Yep. I've only got one, unfortunately.
Nobody wanted to come here.
Yeah.
I rest on my case, which is your focus is on transmissions as the default supplier. And you're talking about developing the TPM so that it solves all the problems of the market and promote the full competition in the market, but it does not, because obviously that would not mimic the case of a competitive market. And I can't see why that you argue that because you're developing the TPM alone, you're going to just looking for its own objectives without looking at the overall objectives of the market.
I might have a go at responding to that. This problem arises, and the reason why we've created this is because we've got big increasing returns to scale. If we had a constant returns to scale, the average bid would be the marginal, there'd be no problem. So you can't apply in this instance what would happen in a constant returns to scale competitive market. It just doesn't work. The second point I want to make is this isn't favouring transmission over anything. It's trying to get at the most efficient outcome, whatever that is. If DG is the most efficient outcome, this will promote DG.
Okay, so I think Michael was next, and then we'll have, sure.
I just want to point out there's clearly an overlap between this approach and the current approach that we use in the CapEx IM for investment, where the processes that we use try to uncover any transmission alternatives that are available, and we consider those in our investment appraisals, and those transmission alternatives can be to defer transmission or investment, or to replace transmission investment altogether. So
sure, yeah,
we'll just need to think about the relationship there, and because potentially I think the existing regime may already do has been envisaged here.
Okay, all right.
It's just something for us to
Yep,
think about.
Thanks, Michael. Yep. Now, I think there was a question over the back, and then there was a Ramu over here.
Yeah, Steve Thornton, PA Consulting Group. Just a very quick comment. I understand the rationale behind the calculation and everything, but I think one of the consequences of the maths involved is there's actually quite a strong incentive for customer A to actually reduce its benefit to zero. So there's almost kind of a stepwise sort of point there, or discontinuity, because of course when they reduce it to zero, they don't just reduce their cost by the marginal cost reduction to Transpower, but they eliminate it altogether. So there is a little bit of a discontinuity at that point.
Yeah, I think we were aware of that. Roger, do you want to talk to that point? I think we actually may have covered it in the paper, from memory.
Quite aware of that point. Inefficient disconnection is an issue, and we have tried to address it. Alistair's going to come to that.
Now, I think Ramu was next, and then Ashley.
Sorry, I think it's just maybe similar to Mike's point, but I somehow think that this sort of already fits within the existing sort of framework, where in evaluating the transmission option, you would have considered potential future DG in the region. And so I think the $9 million, if it was the optimal investment, would have been the one that's been proposed rather than the $10 million one, just because it would have been known at the time of the assessment.
Okay, yep. Do you want to comment on that, Roger?
Yeah, just briefly. I think we've used DG as an example, but it's an example. If for any reason the customer reduces their demands for transmission services, this calculation applies, and it could be, for example, a third party is able to provide DG efficiently to the distributor. So don't focus on the DG bit of it.
Sorry. I know it wasn't specific to the DG. It was just when assessing the investment. I think the forward-looking benefits should consider all of the alternatives, and if this was a reasonable alternative for a future scenario, then I just think that it would have been known at the time the investment was being considered.
If it's known at the time, there's no need for a marginal cost adjustment, because there's no reduction in the benefits that are going to be generated. So this situation only arises where there has been a misperception, a misforecast for some reason.
Sorry to come back, but it has to be resolved before the investment is made, right? Because once the investment is made, there's no chance of adjusting it. Otherwise, you'd have to go to optimization or some other method. So it would have to be before the investment was made, and so I think, yeah, okay.
It's before the investment's approved,
exactly right,
rather than made. But
exactly
yeah,
right.
Yeah. Ashley, I think, was the next.
It appears to me that this looks like some sort of avoided cost of transmission charge almost, or benefit.
But it is forward-looking, remember, so
yeah,
it's not...
forward-looking,
yeah.
and that was going to be my question. For the DG that is going to, or the demand response, or whatever the customer is going to do, stop making widgets, whatever, whatever they're going to do in the future, and they're going to commit to that. There's been many similar types of investments done in the past, or transmission investment avoided in the past through the DG and these various other things happening, yet we're completely ignoring all of those benefits to those people in this process.
And what we're trying to do is just to provide an efficient price signal going forward. So it's about people considering their charges, to provide a price signal in relation to a future investment. Provide that efficient price signal.
Sorry, just to add to that, the customer gets the average benefit from the ones that are exposed beforehand, so that it is in their interest to make this known to Transpower, as if Transpower isn't aware of this, and the customer subsequently, pre-investment, changes its demand.
Okay, we'll move. Oh, sorry, we've got one more.
Just As a customer, do you get a choice as to whether or not you get the assessed charge of $3 million or whether you take 20% of $9 million, which is only $1.8 million in charges?
Short answer is no. If we gave them the 1.8 million, then they would have incentives to inefficiently invest in reducing their demand, because they would invest up to the point of their saving, which would be less than Transpower's saving.
Okay, no more questions on the marginal cost adjustment. Okay. So I'll now discuss the residual charge. So I think you're all very familiar that we're proposing that this would be applied to load customers only. It would recover all revenue not recovered by other TPM charges. So we're talking connection charge, area of benefit, LRMC if it's implemented, and similarly KVAR if it's implemented. And it would recover costs of any optimisation, would recover any costs of the prudent discount policy. The intention with the residual charge, and this is a very important point, is it's not intended to provide a price signal. So the intention with the residual charge is to recover the costs, the remaining costs that aren't recovered by those other charges, in the least distortionary way possible. So that's why we've sought to design it so that it is difficult to avoid. So that's quite a change in thinking from under the status quo, where the interconnection charge is intended to provide a price signal. This one actually is intended to recover costs in as least distorting a way as possible. We're proposing to calculate the charge according to physical capacity, which could be one of those three options. So transformer capacity, line capacity in the 12 months prior to the date of the release of the second issues paper, or each customer's gross anytime maximum demand. And in response to Ashley's question earlier, this is the definition of gross anytime maximum demand. So it's the customer's anytime maximum demand at the GXP plus distributed generation and demand side response. And the reason for that is we're trying to provide, what we're trying to do there with that proposal is to provide not to provide any incentive to install DG or a demand response in order to avoid the charge. We're trying to make it as unavoidable as possible. And so we're proposing that in relation to applying the residual charge to new entrants, that Transpower would develop a proxy for physical capacity, which is unrelated to physical capacity for new entrants. And we're proposing that the physical capacity measure could be updated after a lag, with the lag period proposed by Transpower. And the reason for that is we are trying to make this very much like a lump sum tax, so that it is, again, unavoidable. But over time, we are trying to ensure that it could be adjusted as circumstances change in the market, so that the charges don't get too out of step with the actual situation in the market. Okay, so any questions on that aspect of the residual charge? Ashley?
Very simple question. Distributed generation, does that include cogeneration or exclude cogeneration? So if I've invested in generation inside my factory to depress my demand, do I get the benefit of that?
I think the answer is that it would include that, but I think that would be... Do you have any thoughts on that, Roger?
To be honest, it's a detail I don't think we've really thought about much. So if you've got any views on that, we'd welcome it. But I'd just emphasise the point that Alistair made, that this, in a sense, it doesn't matter how we allocate this. It could be, as some have said, by random numbers, as long as it didn't exceed standalone cost. The point is it's almost like a tax measure. We're trying to find a way of recovering the revenue in a way that doesn't affect use and doesn't affect investment. And so we've tried to get something that seems reasonable, but for efficiency reasons, the exact allocator doesn't matter.
Unless you've got cogeneration inside your factory. And for them, it matters quite a lot.
Yeah, okay, but the key point is
is
it matters then. But in that situation, you know, how are they different from a say a distributor with cogeneration? You know, with distributed generation inside their network, we're trying to apply the charge on an equivalent basis for all customers.
Can I just add to what I was saying? When I said it doesn't matter, I mean it matters a lot to the person who has to pay the charge, obviously. But from the point of view of economic efficiency, it does not matter.
Yeah, granted, it's a wealth transfer. But the people that have that wealth transferred away for them have a very strong point to make about the fact that, you know, they've invested their money inside their plant to reduce their energy costs. And therefore, you know, that's different to a lines company with distributed generation on their grid. It's completely different investment philosophy.
And just to add to that, even though for efficiency in the narrow sense it doesn't matter, if this thing seems unfair, it's not going to be durable, and that matters in that sense. So we are trying to get something that looks reasonable, and if you think that this looks unreasonable, we'd welcome submissions on it.
Yep. One other minor question about this, and that's the 5-year term. I can understand it quite clearly from a distributor and most load parties, but if you're in a large direct connect industrial and you've turned off half of your widget factory in the last 5 years, it probably does make a material difference to the charges that they're going to have.
Yeah. So this is a point that has been raised by a number of parties in that situation. So that's something we are thinking about. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you.
And I mean, if you've got thoughts on that in your submission, then just let us know. Thanks. Yeah. Hi.
Craig from TLC.
Hi, Craig. Thanks.
What's on this bucket? What's the size of it again?
Well, initially it's I think a bit over 600 million. So
it's a big bucket.
It's a big bucket initially. We'd expect it to fall over time. So the area of benefit charge we'd expect would actually build up relatively quickly because it does cover all new investment and replacement and refurbishment. So it would be a big bucket but getting smaller over time. But it does, for example, the unallocated operating expenses and overhead, that's almost 200 million. So that, you know, it's going to go down to at least something like that. If everything's covered through the area of benefit charge.
So, and this is the bit I don't understand. So it's a big bucket,
yeah,
and the authority's pushing distributors at the moment to be cost reflective, service based. But the biggest bucket we've got, you're proposing it's not these things.
Well, I guess we've proposed that the area of benefit charge should be applied to all new investment. And that's important for providing an efficient price signal going forward. Then the question is, okay, going back, I mean, there is the question of should the area of benefit charge be applied to all historical investment as well? And I mean, our judgment was the key issue there is firstly is that, you know, what's the sort of the price signal that's being provided, but the second issue is it practicable to apply something like an area of benefit charge to all historical investments. And our judgment was that in practicability terms, it was really only practicable to apply it to a limited set of historical investments.
I think the point here is that this is to recover sunk investments, historical investments. So things that you do in the future can't change those costs. They've already been made. So the key point here is that the structure of the charge, you really want to de-link it from consumption or investment, so that people don't respond to a price signal thinking that they're actually going to change the costs when the costs have already been incurred for all of these investments. That's the key thing, the de-linking.
Can I add to that? All the future decisions that anybody will make as a consequence of this change in regime, potential change in regime, will be fully cost reflective and fully service based. So the point is that you can't change what we're saying. You can't change your past. We're trying to get future decisions fully efficient.
So the reason we've proposing applying the charges to those historical investments is principally for durability. So that, yeah. Okay, now I think Jeremy was next, and then Kieran.
So this is part of statement and part of question, but if I'm correct, in the way that this was introduced, then the authority establishes a charge through a guideline, and then Transpower has to develop that into a method. And I think it's questions like the amount of our revenue that's recovered through this charge, and a bunch of these sort of questions that are coming out now are probably difficult to answer at this stage. Obviously, the authorities modelled one potential hypothetical example of that using imperfect information, as it's had to.
Yep.
But it's probably quite important that we don't place too much stock on that and recognise that whether it's $600 million or $300 million that's recovered through the area of benefit charge, through the residual, won't be known until further down the track. And I think similarly, judgments about what is and isn't practical can't be made until we've had a think about what an area benefit charge might look like. I completely accept that under some circumstances, if it's a very, very complicated approach, then it might be difficult to do that for the entire grid, but under some other options it may be quite viable, and that could produce potentially much better outcomes. So I suppose my comment is really, or question is really that those matters are yet to be decided, or am I correct in thinking that?
Not quite. The guidelines do specify the investments, or at least the proposed guidelines specify the investments that the area benefit charge would apply to with respect to historical and new. So we do know the revenue at least that would need to be recovered in relation to those historical investments.
But just to add to that, Alistair, obviously we're consulting on these guidelines.
Yeah, we are
it's
consulting.
a proposal, so we haven't made up our minds. So we're looking for feedback on that. So obviously it's a proposal, but so Alistair's response was assuming that that would be affected. So just be mindful that this is a proposal. We will take into account some submissions on the proposal, as we always do, and make a decision based on those submissions, and particularly whether they cause us to change our thinking about how the proposal affects the statutory objective.
Absolutely, and I think it is very important when we're talking about practicality, and I think some of the issues about how we as Transpower might implement some of these things are very, very seriously affected by the way you sort of state your starting point. And if, for example, we start implementing an area benefit charge for all prospective investments, so we go on down to a very low level of expenditure.
Yeah.
Say insulators, replacing insulators on a tower. We're painting a tower, we're replacing some tower foundations, but we're not replacing the steel. Under some scenarios, that could become very, very, very complicated. We have different asset valuations and different charges being overlaid on top of each other, let alone the discount, various discounts. Under other options, it could be very simple, and you might, but between the two options, you could produce very similar efficiency outcomes in terms of price signals and cost allocations. So I think my point was really that ideally, some of those matters would best be either discussed with Transpower, which they haven't been, or left for Transpower to work through as part of developing the TPM. So that was all I had to say. I obviously understand we're in a consultation process, and this was, just sharing some thoughts on that.
I think we'd absolutely agree that that it's important that the application of the charge is done in as practicable a way as possible, and we would expect that to affect actually the efficiency outcomes. So if you were charging an area benefit charge for each insulator, I would imagine the transaction cost of that would be extremely high, and that would affect the efficiency of a charge designed in that way. So there is an interaction between practicability and efficiency. But yeah, part of the schema of the overall code around the TPM is that Transpower, has to basically converts the guidelines, which are the sort of the overall allocation, which is determined by the authority, into sort of a practical methodology in developing the TPM. So we would be looking for Transpower to sort of do that in as practical ways as they can, consistent with the requirements in the code, that it has to be consistent with the statutory objective, Part 4, and of course the guidelines themselves. So does anybody want to add anything to that? Okay. Does that answer your question, Jeremy, or you're looking very sceptical there, I have to say.
I think the point was really that we need to think very carefully in terms of how you prescribe things in the guidelines.
Yeah.
That you're not making judgments that you're not misunderstanding what might be practical and what might not be practical, and therefore hard coding certain things at this stage that might produce prohibit the development of a better solution as part of the implementation. So it's kind of a procedural point, but it's not a criticism of any of this. I think some of the things you could do could produce much better outcomes, much more cost-reflective pricing, much better price signals, and be simpler to implement. That's I guess my real point.
Right, sure.
But that's fine.
Yeah.
We'll
so
talk
if you
about
don't,
this.
yeah. So if you don't think we have in our proposed guidelines, they're not sufficiently practical, of course, we'd welcome your feedback on that. Yep. Okay. So who was next? Oh, Kieran. Sorry. Yes.
I sort of asking a question in response to your responses. With the 2004 date, which I think you explained was the primary reason for that was one of practicality.
Two reasons, sort of practicality and durability.
Right.
Yeah.
So on the practicality reason, I just wanted, are you able to elaborate a bit about what are the sort of costs that might be incurred if you were to go back to an earlier date relative to the sort of the benefits that you might have imagined? And I understand you're in a world where you don't know the methodology which will be applied, so the uncertainty. And related to that, because the benefit, I was curious to the Oakley Greenwood answer was that, in fact, one of the primary reasons was around the price signals of sunk investments. And I just wonder how you factored that into your analysis.
Okay, so in terms of, perhaps if I handle the practicality and if somebody else can perhaps handle the price signals matter. So in terms of practicality, so I guess the first thing, it is, if we're doing it, I guess, to a relatively, it's a new charge, and we have to try and implement that charge, that new charge in a sort of a practical way. And so we thought, from that point of view, applying it to a relatively limited number of investments would make that, by that initial implementation, a more practical process. I guess our thinking was probably coloured by the feedback, though, we got on the first issues paper, where we'd proposed a threshold of $2 million, and that was for a different type of charge, and it was going to be a regularly calculated charge. This charge we'd anticipate would be calculated much more infrequently, but that initial process for calculating the charge, it would still be relatively complex matter, figuring out what was an investment, for each aspect right across the grid. So we thought, well, in those terms, limiting it would be more practical. The durability point, we did, in the options working paper, we had application A and application B of the charge. So application A was doing something similar to what we're proposing. Application B was just new investments. And we heard in submissions, and when we went out and talked, we heard, for example, from some South Island customers that their perspective was, well, sure, application B would be great, but once we get our new investment, we don't want to have to pay for Auckland's. So that just raised the spectre that it would not be durable from the get-go, that they'd be seeking and change to the TPM. So that was really the durability point. On the price signal point,
yeah, basically from our perspective in doing the CBA, we don't really care about the pricing of historical investments unless it distorts future consumption behaviour or future investment behaviour. So if it's within the standalone and avoidable cost test, the efficient pricing band, then that's fine. It basically ticks that latter about investment behaviour. And if it's de-linked from consumption, so it's not sending a marginal price signal to recover an historical investment, then it ticks that one as well. Then within that band, basically anywhere within that band is an efficient outcome. Now there's obviously always the equity considerations that can be considered, but from the CBA's point of view, we're not looking at that. We're just looking at those economic efficiency aspects of the price signal and whether it's going to distort future consumption or future investment decisions.
Yes, okay. Oh, sorry, there's one here and then Stephen.
No.
So the residual charge was recover the balance of the revenue cap for Transpower?
Yes.
And even we have a situation of excess supply at the moment, basically all the past infrastructure investment would be qualified to be eligible for recovery?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Now, this, so you have Transpower, which is one of the suppliers in the market who got guaranteed recovery of revenue. So what about other players in the market who've made investment as well? They don't get this guarantee of recovery of investment, even we have got to the situation of excess supply. It could be Transpower's fault, or it could be somebody else's fault, or it could be just economic sizing, because you need to amplify by a significant amount to, for a transmission link. You can't just do half or a quarter of it, right?
Yeah, sure.
So economic sizing may take us to this, but I can see there is a differentiation, this differentiated treatment here of one supplier gets a guarantee of recovery, and you treated all the investment as qualified for recovery. While many of the other parts of the market, there's no such arrangement in place.
Yeah, so I mean, this is something first, I guess the first point to make here is that the fact that Transpower is able to recover its revenue is not determined by the Electricity Authority, it's determined by the Commerce Commission. And the Commerce Commission has made the judgment that they would have a lower WACC in return for guaranteed revenue recovery. Now, that's their judgment. I mean, in making that judgment, presumably they would have considered the competition effects of doing that. So, and in terms of the TPM, the authorities are required to consider a TPM that's consistent with Transpower recovering its full allowable revenue. So we are not able to propose a TPM that recovers less than Transpower's full allowable revenue.
But you don't look at similar regimes for other suppliers?
Well, my point is that basically we are given an amount of revenue to be recovered, and then we have to design guidelines for recovery of that revenue. So it's the amount is predetermined.
Right. I understand that. Yeah. But I just see the difference between or the inconsistency between the approach for the TPM and the DG, the Part 6 propositions, where here there is a guarantee of recovery of investment.
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Basically, all the investment that was made, which have led us to, and I accept that there could be a situation of excess supply.
I mean, your argument is, I presume what you're talking about is in relation to the pricing principles and our proposal to remove the pricing principles, and that is inconsistent with Transpower receiving fully recovered revenue. Right. I mean, as I said, that is the guaranteed revenue is not us determining the guaranteed revenue. So we're not the party making that determination. That is actually another party, which is the Commerce Commission.
But you are making a determination which endorses the recovery of investment costs.
But we're not able to do anything else.
Legislation prevents us from doing that.
All right. Yeah. But as long as you acknowledge that you've made this decision with that particular consideration, with that
we're required by the code to do that.
Yes, but that rule or that principle has been used here,
and it would be only consistent if you are going to apply the same principle elsewhere in the market.
But you just think how that may work out. Transpower may look for a transmission alternative, and they could tender for a DG or demand response. And Roger may want to answer this because he's a better economist than me. But what would happen is that parties would put forward a proposal that would reflect the fact that they can't recover their full cost. So they would actually, as part of that, there'd be a higher WACC associated with their particular proposal. So they might, for Transpower, may say, we need this transmission alternative for this period of time, and it could either be DR or DG, and a party would say, look, well, we're prepared to do that, and they'd factor in, look, they're not going to get full recovery, but as part of that, therefore, they'd put in a, I suppose, for want of a better word, a tender, which would have an inherently higher WACC than Transpower would get.
Okay, now
I think
Stephen had a question.
I'd probably just make a more general point, which is that our hands are bound in two ways. One is that we have to recover the demand, and two, we have to design the regime for the long-term benefit of consumers, and that is what we have tried to do.
Okay, I think the next question was Stephen, just over the side.
Yeah, Stephen Batstone, Sapro Research Group. You've talked a lot about delinking the residual from consumption decisions and desperately trying to avoid distorting consumers' decisions with it. I assume, therefore, you've got some quite strong views on how distributors would pass this through, and if so, I guess the supplementary question would be, is that how you modelled it in the CBA?
Yes.
Did you just want to go forward a bit there, Ron?
Yes, is the simple answer. We did assume that a more cost-reflective transmission price would flow through to more cost-reflective retail prices, and therefore consumers would respond to those more cost-reflective retail charges, which would then in turn affect the quantity of transmission services that were demanded and the cost of providing transmission services.
Can you be more specific about the charge? Was it a fixed charge? Or?
Obviously, for it to affect customers' demand for electricity services, it needs to be reflected in a variable charge and not a fixed charge. So that's the underlying assumption, is that at the moment those transmission prices would be reflected in a fixed charge to the end consumer because of the delinking between quantity and the cost of transmission services. But now suddenly, if there's a more cost-reflective transmission charge, you would see that flow through to a variable retail charge. Now, they're the assumptions that we've used.
Right, so the residual which we're delinking was fixed.
Not the residual. This is all about forward-looking investment. The residual would be recovered through a fixed charge.
Okay.
Because of that delinking from consumption.
So just to maybe, John, is that the authority?
Probably good questions to raise at distribution pricing workshop, which we're having on the 15th of, I think it's 15th or maybe the 17th of August, I've forgotten the date. But if you read distribution pricing paper, we countenance sort of peak charging and capacity-based charging is the appropriate way for distributors to move, and we think that is more service-based and cost-reflective. So I think that's an opportunity to come and explore those issues at that particular session.
James was next.
Yeah, James Tipping. Just a quick question on whether you looked at other allocators here. So I understand the desire to lock in the charges and for them not to give any incentive on consumers to change behaviour. But one example that sprung to mind is if you use shares of historic shares of RCPD over the last 5 years, would that have had any downsides compared to this proposal?
In terms of, I mean, our proposal was really what we were trying to when we were initially thinking about that was, you know, what's a sort of a comparable basis across all transmission customers, and that was why we at least on low customers, and that was why we're proposing physical capacity. And but yeah, certainly any historical measure would be a way to avoid distorting behaviour. I guess the question though is if you have this update and you've based it on use in the past, then perhaps the expectation might be you would use use in the future, in which case there is sort of potentially a risk, I guess, there of providing incentives for changes in use. Of course, you could use capacity going forward, and then in which case you'd have, at that point, a sort of similar transitional issue to what people are raising now.
Yeah, I think any update to any allocator and over a time period would place some sort of signal on there, though.
Yeah, sure,
It's
and that's
AMD
why
or
we're
share of
proposing a long
RCPD or
period.
whatever. Yeah.
Yeah.
I just think, shares of historic RCPD would have much less of a reshuffling effect compared to using AMD, which is a completely new allocator that we haven't had
I might
before.
just add something here. We've tried to make clear that we want the updates to be sufficiently far in the past that at any reasonable commercial discount rate, they will effectively not alter future use. The allocator you use, as I said, doesn't really matter from an efficiency point of view. And so what we are trying to get is an allocator that looks reasonable and feels reasonable, so it doesn't undermine the durability of the TPM. Which if people have got different views from us on what that allocator should be quite happy to hear it.
Was there one more question? Okay, all right. So I think we'll move on to the next slide. What's just checking timing, John? And what time was afternoon?
So I think we're about a third the way.
And afternoon tea was it?
And afternoon tea's at 3, so I think we're okay.
Okay,
Yep.
good.
There's, based on yesterday, there was a lot of questions on the residual.
The next one, yes. So the next thing we'll talk about is the prudent discount policy. So there is an existing prudent discount policy which provides a customer with a discount to their transmission charge if they are able to bypass the grid with a project that is a lower cost than their existing transmission charge. And under the existing TPM and the existing PDP, that prudent discount could apply for a period of 15 years. So we're proposing to extend that so that it would apply for the expected life of the relevant asset. So in the situation where you're talking about bypass, it's the asset, the life of the asset to provide the bypass. We're proposing to extend the prudent discount policy so that load customers could apply for a prudent discount if they were able to build generation in order to self-supply and therefore disconnect from the grid. Secondly, if there was they were material at risk of closing down their plant and so therefore would disconnect from the grid. Thirdly, if the transmission charges exceeded their standalone costs so that they were effectively cross-subsidising other customers. And if a distributor had an embedded customer, then they would be able to receive a prudent discount for reasons B and C above. So with respect to closure risk, that would be available to customers for whom transmission charges are a material cost. And I don't think we've actually specified what that level of materiality is. That would be something for Transpower to determine when they were developing the TPM. It would be linked to key factors affecting the closure decision, and we're suggesting that, for example, that could be the world price of the customer's output, so that if the customer changed, if that world price changed, then the level of the discount may also alter to reflect that. So then there's the question of who would actually make the decision regarding prudent discounts, particularly with respect to exit, charges exceeding standalone costs, or those equivalents for a distributor. And so we're requesting views on that as to whether that should be Transpower or the authority. I guess the general feedback that we've heard to date is there seems to be more of a preference for the authority, although I've heard from some parties that they think some other agency should do that, and in anticipation of any questions in that regard, I mean, we're restricted in our ability to determine specify which agency. So obviously we can tell ourselves what to do, and we're limited as to who else. So Transpower, as the party responsible for the TPM, would obviously be another reasonable candidate. Okay, so that was the prudent discount, and then just the next slide is just showing the effect that if we provide a prudent discount, that means that of the remaining customers, they would avoid higher charges if the parties subject to the prudent discount exited. So this is an example that's provided in the paper. The orange bars show the distribution of charges amongst distributors under our proposal. The light blue bars show the proposal with PDPs in total value of $30 million, and then you'll see the black bars show the charges if the party subject to the charge exited. So you'll see that by providing a prudent discount, then parties face a lower charge than they would if the parties had actually exited. So, and there is a benefit. There is actually an economic benefit in that, because that avoids higher charges and therefore higher incentives to undertake inefficient behaviour by remaining customers to avoid the charge. Okay, so are there any questions on the prudent discount policy? Ramu.
Hello?
Yeah. Hello.
So the PDP, whatever's left over gets added into the residual. So
yes,
if a PDP
right.
is granted, so presumably the residual is spread across everybody besides the person who the PDP was granted to.
That's correct. Yep. Okay. Okay. So this probably. Oh, that one. Okay. Sorry. Well, that was, yeah. So what this is showing is that the cost of the PDP is recovered through the residual charge. So you'll see that even though this is $30 million in cost, the incremental change in charges is relatively small. Yeah. So it would be the cost of the PDP would just be recovered through the residual. So it would be recovered from load customers. Okay. Any other questions?
But that would be better than that customer going out of business and not contributing anything to sunk investments. I mean, that's the important thing, I think, with the PDP, is it actually leads to both efficient outcomes and it's good for all of the existing customer base. If the alternative is for that customer to go out of business and not contribute $1 to those sunk investments.
And that's what that diagram shows there.
Just Jeremy Stevenson right here with a quick question on the graph.
Sorry.
Is that energy prices in total, or is that just transmission costs?
So this is transmission charges.
Have you done any models or scenarios around the overall change in energy cost from this kind of allocation, or from the three scenarios that you model there?
I don't believe we have. So I mean, that's obviously a consideration, but I mean, this is, but obviously in the cost benefit analysis, that sort of issue is considered. Rowan, do you want to comment on the sort of the PDP, how it's factored in the CBA?
Yes, we did quantify this benefit as part of the CBA. It's obviously a fairly complex thing to model, but we've taken a couple of large businesses, I won't name them, but effectively looked at what the gross profits would be with and without the current transmission charge. The current transmission charge versus if they were charged at an avoidable cost level, based on our estimates, and looked at whether it would change a negative gross profit situation to a positive gross profit situation, basically, and probability weighted it, and looked at what the value of that was. So that's how we came up with our valuation for the PDP. Now, obviously, it's very bespoke. It's going to be particularly, or it's going to be related to the individual circumstances of a customer. So all we've been able to do is just look at a couple of existing customers and their particular publicly available information.
Can I just clarify, Rowan, you didn't take into account the energy price effect, did you? Because that's a wealth transfer.
That's a wealth transfer.
That's a wealth transfer. So yeah, just to answer your question, Jeremy, so it didn't take into account the energy price effect, the effect in the wholesale market or potentially the hedge market. No, because that'd be a wealth transfer.
Okay, no further questions. Okay, so So as you'll be aware, so under the proposal, Transpower would have three main mechanisms to discount its transmission charges to customers, and there are pragmatic aspects of the proposal to ensure that transmission pricing can adjust to the real-world changes and continue to deliver the outcomes for consumers, good outcomes for consumers. So, and these sorts of adjustments are provided in workably competitive markets. So we've got the expansion of the prudent discount policy, and that's needed primarily because of the residual charge. And so, and Rowan's explained the sort of the reasons for that. We've also, as I mentioned earlier, we have optimisation, so that would apply to the area of benefit charge, and that would be optimised if there's a substantial reduction in demand, and avoids customers paying substantially higher prices if a single large customer or local economic conditions change substantially. And then we've also provided the area of benefit charge for a revision to the calculation of the charge if there is a material change in circumstances, and therefore there would be a revision to the charge to an area of benefit charge in relation to an area if that was the case. So, any questions on that slide? Okay. So, in addition to the main components, we're also proposing 5 additional components, and these additional components, they're matters for Transpower to consider whether implementing these would promote the statutory objective. But if Transpower doesn't consider they promote the statutory objective, then it would be desirable for Transpower to keep those matters under review. So the additional components, there's the long-run marginal cost charge, the KVAR charge, and then the next 3 of those additional components relate to the connection charge, so staged commissioning, charging for assets when other grid investments join those in a loop, and allocation of operating and maintenance costs. That final one also would apply to the area of benefit charge as well. And in addition, we're proposing some code changes. So the TPM would be part of the code, but we're also proposing some additional code changes in relation to loss and constraint, allocation, and also power factors.
It's 3 o'clock, so we could...
okay.
How about we stop for coffee and we can wait and answer any questions on this slide and wait in anticipation as Alistair will after lunch work through these additional components. Unless there's a...
Real simple question. The long run marginal cost, and I don't know if you're going to be able to answer it even, you're proposing that Transpower think about it. If they were to come up with a proposal, where would you expect the reduction in other charges to come from? Would you expect them to reduce their cost recovery through area of benefit, or would you expect them to reduce their cost recovery through the residual charge?
Through the residual.
Excellent, thank you.
Yep.
Great. All right, if we come back, sort of sit down by about 25 to half past, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, so we were discussing the additional components, and we'll start with the long run marginal cost charge. We're proposing, as I said, this is an additional component. So this is not a component, this is a component that Transpower would propose if they considered that there were, that it was consistent with the statutory objective from implementing this component, but if they didn't, then it would be desirable for it to be kept under review. And that's the same for the other additional components. Our thinking around the long-run marginal cost charge is that nodal pricing provides efficient price signals around the short-run marginal cost of using the grid. And as the grid becomes more congested, average nodal prices downstream rise, and of course upstream they fall. And so eventually those nodal prices rise just enough to justify investing in the grid because of the savings and the reduced cost of losses and constraints. So if the investment is triggered by something else, it may be efficient to ration grid use to defer the investment. So we're therefore proposing that if there is a case for a charge to ration that grid use, then Transpower could introduce the charge to efficiently defer the investment where the nodal prices might be insufficient to signal the current and future costs of using the interconnected grid. So I guess the key point here is that we think the primary signalling device for efficient timing of investment is through nodal prices, but there may be situations where an additional signal through an LRMC charge may be appropriate. And it would be up to Transpower to propose the detailed design of that. So we haven't provided a sort of a detailed example of the long run marginal cost charge in this paper, and we have discussed sort of our thoughts about what a long run marginal cost charge might look like in previous papers, so the options working paper and the LRMC charge working paper. But we expect that if introduced, the LRMC charge would be applied where there's a risk that the investment might be inefficiently undertaken. We expect that it would apply to peak congestion where that congestion could bring forward an efficient new investment. And we think it could be set to increase with increasing demand, so that the investment would continue to be deferred and then removed when the investment becomes efficient and is therefore made. But a key point is that it would need to be better than actually improving the signal that's provided through nodal prices themselves. Okay, so are there any questions in relation to the LRMC charge proposal? Excellent, okay. Sorry, there is one? Bramu, sorry, apologies. I'm not looking right across the room, my apologies. I see you now, and Sultan's on her way with the microphone.
I just had a question. Through the investment process, do you think that the way you identifying beneficiaries through this investment process, that would not substitute for an LRMC, or why do you think that wouldn't bring these alternatives out that you're trying to capture through this charge? Why don't you think those alternatives will come out through the investment process once you try and identify an area of benefit, which I think would be sort of similar to this?
Yeah, so I think actually probably in some ways I think we're agreeing with what you're thinking. So what we're saying is that we think there would be a signal through the area of benefit charge because there is the prospect of that future area of benefit charge if the investment proceeds, and that would provide incentives for customers, Transpower's customers, to make changes to defer that investment. And that could involve, for example, distributors that would be subject to that charge implementing a charge themselves that would enable the demand, the investment to be deferred. So we think that and in some ways that's one way you can see that is sort of reflected in the cost benefit analysis that sort of reflects that thinking that customers will actually respond to the prospect of a charge. It's only if there's a situation where customers aren't responding to that charge that Transpower may consider that actually an additional signal's necessary, and that's in that situation they'd propose an LRMC charge.
Yeah, and I was just going to make that same point, that we've effectively used the long-run marginal cost calculation as a proxy for the area of benefit price signal in doing the CBA. So they should be very, very similar.
But you're proposing to remove the signal once, so if somebody does do take some action in response to the LRMC, and suppose the investment's still made, then that signal is now removed, and so that whatever investment has been made by the local downstream participant is now, I guess, out of the money, right?
Well, in that situation, the investment hasn't been deferred. The investment has occurred, and the need for a signal would relate to that the next investment. but immediately following the investment being made, there isn't any need for a signal beyond nodal pricing. So nodal pricing is still providing that initial signal once the investment's been made.
Can I just add to that? So imagine there wasn't any nodal pricing to make the thought experiment easy. Then you would see demand increasing to getting to the point of congestion, and then you get an outage. So what you would try to do is put in a price signal to ration the use of that particular circuit. You wouldn't want to invest immediately, because you know that the last unit of electricity that just caused the outage is the only benefit, the only cost of rationing, and that's at the margin near zero, whereas the investment is really expensive. So you keep on increasing that charge until such time as you determine that the investment is worth it. Then a nodal price falls to near zero. Well, sorry, it's always zero, but the LRMC charge falls to zero. But it's replaced by a charge on the capacity charge, the area of benefit charge, so that the cost being paid by the person who is on that circuit is similar, but instead of coming through the LRMC charge, it comes through the area of benefit charge.
Okay, Ashley.
That's going to make me awfully nervous as an investor in the avoidance of that transmission, because I don't know how long I'm going to be there. I have no certainty of revenue. How the hell are I going to value the investment?
Sorry, which investment are you talking about?
The one to avoid the transmission investment. If the charge is only existing until such times as the investment is made, how is the person investing in DG or DR expected to value that when they have no idea how long that revenue stream is going to remain?
The same way they do with nodal prices at the moment. Because there are two substitutes, effectively.
Yep, okay.
Okay, no further questions on long run marginal cost charge? Okay. Oh, sorry.
Well, as I said before, except that if that new investment is made by Transpower, then they guarantee to recover that cost, but nobody else.
Okay, I think we've addressed that point earlier, so we won't say anything further on that. Okay, anything else? Okay, the next item is on allocation of loss and constraint excess. So this is actually not an additional component. This is in fact a change to the code. So currently, loss and constraint excess is allocated as follows. So the LCE arising in relation to connection, HVDC and interconnection assets is calculated using rental guides that Transpower has that provides, and they identify what rentals arise on each of those sets of assets, and then the rentals are allocated to each of those sets of assets, and then customers receive the LCE that reflects their share of charges in relation to each one of those assets. So what we're proposing is that we're proposing to codify that LCE attributable to specific assets is allocated to customers that pay charges in relation to those assets. And there, the LCE would again be, just like the status quo, would be proportional to the customer's charges for those assets. So if you think of an area of benefit asset, so say an example would be, for example, say the HVDC, if at the moment that's allocated to South Island generators, the change, so under our modelling, that indicates that the charges would be shared between South Island generators and North Island load, so the LCE would go proportional to each of those groups of customers' charges. So it's a sort of a subtle change, but it is probably just slightly more specific than under the status quo. Any LCE that's remaining to be allocated to customers, so it's that there's LCE arising on assets that aren't covered by a particular charge, be that the area of benefit charge or the connection charge, would then go to those customers paying the residual charge in proportion again to each customer's charges. That's quite a mouthful. Does anybody have any questions? Shane.
Just to clarify, when you refer here to LCE, Alistair, I presume you're talking residual LCE post allocation of the FTR grids.
Yeah.
LCE to the FTR payouts.
Yeah. So this is LCE following FTR settlement.
So this proposal won't
LCE.
affect the revenue adequacy of FTRs.
No. So it's not proposing any change to the FTR regime. It's LCE that remains after that settlement of FTRs. Yeah. Okay, any other questions? Okay. So the next additional component that we're going to talk about is the KVAR charge, and this is an aspect that we have. We did propose in the first issues paper, and we got, I think, a reasonable degree of support for this component. But since that time, there has actually been a significant rise in power factors across the country. So what the KVAR charge is that transmission customers and their customers can result in a reactive power and a need for static reactive support equipment to rectify a poor power factor. And so the proposal is to apply a KVAR charge so that those that cause the need for reactive support would pay for it. And that charge would be applied according to their KVAR draw. And Transpower would determine where and when that charge would apply. The rate of the charge would relate to the long-run marginal cost of that static reactive support equipment. So this was an aspect, or at least that's what we suggested would be the case in the first issues paper. So that would be, but that would certainly be one way of applying it. And so it would be up to Transpower to determine if there was a need for a KVAR charge, and we're suggesting that because of the power factor tending towards a unity level, that there isn't actually a need for a KVAR charge at this time. And so for that reason, we've suggested it's an additional component. So it's for a matter for Transpower to consider whether it would promote the statutory objective, but if not, we think it would be desirable for them to keep under review. In addition to this additional component, we're also proposing to amend the connection code. Currently, there's a requirement that for unity, a power factor of unity in all, for some regions, and that is impracticable to achieve. And so we're suggesting relaxing that power factor requirement to 0.95 in all regions. And so, yeah, so that's another aspect that they were suggesting should be changed. So does anybody have any questions on this this additional component? Okay. So we have, as I explained, there are three additional components that relate to the connection charge, although there is the third of those additional components also relates to the area of benefit charge. So the connection charge, it recovers the costs of connection assets, and we are proposing that it be retained because it's service-based and cost-effective. We're proposing three additional components in relation to the connection charge for Transpower to consider whether it would promote the statutory objective. So the first of those is that with respect to staged commissioning, we're proposing a clarification to the TPM that if assets are commissioned such that they provide connection services for an intermediate period, but they're ultimately configured and charged for and charged for under the area of benefit charge, that they would be charged for as connection assets. So an issue arose in Auckland where the North Auckland and Northland investment, and that investment initially, as it was commissioned, it was providing services just as to Vector, and they were effectively connection assets. Eventually, that investment became an interconnection asset, and so therefore it went to the interconnection charge. There was a court case about this, finding that the authority's position that those assets should be charged as connection assets was upheld, and so therefore we're proposing that this would be a component that Transpower could address just to provide clarity around that. The second additional component is that proposing a method to ensure that charges that apply to assets that provide connection services are not changed if there's an investment that would basically change the definition of those assets. And so the reason for that is there may be situations where it's privately beneficial to the customer to make that investment, but not efficient. That wouldn't be efficient overall. So we're proposing a change there. And the third aspect is just to propose that with respect to operating and maintenance costs for connection assets and for area benefit assets, that would be done on an actual costs basis. Okay, are there any questions with respect to those additional components? Yes, down the back.
On number 3, how does that relate to the overhead and unallocated operating costs for the connection assets?
So in terms of, so this is just the operating and maintenance costs, which are allocated costs. The unallocated bit, that is in with respect to connection charges. So some of that is that isn't proposed to change under this aspect, except to the extent that those unallocated operating expenses actually do become allocated. So if through the course of, if Transpower says actually it relates to particular investments, then they would go from that effectively overhead bucket to the operating costs bucket for determining connection charges. Does that make sense? Or yep, thanks. Yeah, Michael.
Alistair, just in relation to number 1 there, can I just understand, sometimes there are operational reasons why assets are commissioned in a particular way, and for efficiency, cost efficiency. Sometimes it seems to me that there is for operational reasons, which Transpower may commission assets in a way that does create connection assets temporarily, and that's the optimal thing to do.
Yeah.
Shouldn't that be a good outcome? But if the connected party is then going to have to pay for these things as connection assets, they would put pressure on us not to do that.
Yeah. Sure. So I think we're proposing that this additional component would be something for Transpower that Transpower would do if Transpower considered it would promote the statutory objective. So Transpower would need to think about whether that was efficient. But it is also, the idea with this is to ensure that charges are service-based. So if a customer is receiving those services, they receive charges that relate to the service that they're receiving. And it reflects the cost of those services, so it's consistent with that.
But potentially if there are efficiency reasons, then it could be not applied for a particular.
This would be so. This is an additional component for Transpower to consider. So if Transpower considered it didn't promote the statutory objective at this time, then it would Transpower would not have to advance that particular component until such time as it did think that there were net benefits.
Okay, thanks.
Sure, Jeremy.
Alistair, am I correct
Jeremy
in thinking?
and then another Jeremy.
Am I correct in thinking that, and I didn't follow the Vector litigation as closely as I might have, but that today the authority's interpretation of the TPM is that staged commissioning, under staged commissioning, those assets are treated as connection assets?
That's correct. Yeah.
So I think the efficiency problem that Mike's alluding to is present today, and I think our view was that our view was that there were good operational reasons, efficiency reasons for doing what we did. However, had we understood the interpretation the authority was going to take of the TPM, then Vector would rightfully have objected, and we probably would have adjusted our commissioning plan. I think that's the concern. So the concern exists today. Perhaps the question around one is whether we could propose a change to adjust that. Is that what you're suggesting here, or?
So we're proposing. I mean, what we're suggesting is just to, we're proposing a clarification to confirm the authority's position. So that's what we're proposing here. And that was the position that was, reached during that court process. So we're just actually proposing a clarification to confirm that is the situation. That's the proposal.
Jeremy, I think when the authorities, I'm pretty sure I'm correct here, Alistair, because I wasn't too involved in it either, when the authority released its decision not to grant an exemption, it detailed why that thought it was efficient, notwithstanding the potential counter-efficiencies that both you and Michael have raised. Was particularly concerned about people changing their behaviour following negotiations or things like that. So, but I wasn't involved in it, but that decision I think is public in terms of not to grant an exemption, and the efficiency considerations relating to that were definitely considered by the board.
Sorry, and that is probably a good segue into my question. I was going to actually ask, in terms of the cost-benefit analysis for this particular code change, how have you assessed the benefits and potential costs of this clarification/codification?
We didn't go into the absolute detail numerics of the costs and the benefits of this particular change.
So you didn't look at the behavioural impacts and the changes it might create for participants?
No.
So I think it was just a qualitative assessment.
Yes, it was just a qualitative assessment.
But I think, Jeremy, the point that Alistair made, just reiterate that, is that Transpower will look at this and see if it's in the benefits of consumers, promotes our statutory objective, is consistent with the guidelines and consistent with Part 4. They'll make a recommendation to the board, and the board will, as part of that, have to go through a process of consultation, including determining whether it believes it's in the net benefits of consumers as well. So to the extent that a cost-benefit analysis can be, a quantitative cost-benefit analysis can be done, one would be undertaken.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, so I'll just, what I suggest is we just skip through to modelling of the charges, and we'll do the CBA, and then we'll come back to this explanation for why we think our proposal would advance the statutory objectives. So over to David on modelling.
Thanks, Alistair. I'll be covering a few slides just looking at the modelling assumptions, and then we'll take a look at the results from the modelling just to get a bit of an overview for what we've seen. First, I'd just like to emphasise that the modelling is indicative. We don't know exactly what method Transpower will propose, and there could be various options even within something like the VSPUD method. So we need to keep an open mind and just treat the charges as indicative, and I think Jeremy pointed on that earlier. We also need to keep in mind that the purpose of the modelling is not to look at the specific charges to several decimal points, it's to help people understand the method and how it could be applied. But as I say, this is only one way the methodology could be applied. So the modelling uses market data from 2014, but we're actually modelling a 2019 scenario, so we've scaled that market data as a proxy for 2019. And the status quo charges actually include the 2017 TPM amendments. So if anyone's comparing current charges with the status quo charges we've modelled, they just need to keep those subtleties in mind. We haven't modelled the connection charge or the LCE, so if anyone's comparing charges again, they just need to keep those factors in mind. In terms of broad assumptions, both Huntly-Rankin units are assumed to be in service. Otahu B and Southdown are assumed out of service. There's a few other minor changes. We've assumed open cycle gas turbines are available for make-up generation in the counterfactual scenario in the VSPUD modelling. So overall, we've used two separate methods for the modelling. For the 6 largest transmission investments, we've used the VSPUD method. For the smaller investments, where that sort of detailed modelling wasn't really warranted, we've used a more regional approach, and that's very similar to what was used in 2015 issues paper. So that's just more of an engineering assessment of where the beneficiaries are on a regional basis, rather than a GXP basis. Now, the VSPUD modelling relies on formation of grid constraints, and the results can be relatively sensitive to those constraints. So we provided a sensitivity that's available on page 252 of the issues paper, and that just shows if there is a change in the level of a constraint for one investment, what the change in the allocation can be and the level of the benefits. So if people are interested in that aspect, that may be worth looking at. In reality, Transpower have the resources to tie those constraints down quite accurately if they were using the VSPUD method, for example, whereas we've had to estimate those constraints. There are a number of other simplifications that we've used in the modelling. The modelling assumed all investments are independent. That's quite important from how we've had to model the counterfactual samples in the VSPUD modelling. In reality, transmission investments are always slightly dependent on other investments in the region. We've only modelled 1 year of data as well. So we've modelled the 2014 base data as a 2019 year. We haven't modelled multiple contingencies or outages. We've just modelled that 1 year scenario for each investment. That's quite a representative year in terms of hydro flows. There is some south flow on the HVDC, but still it's only a 1 year snapshot. Also, the modelling doesn't include small embedded generation. Now that can be quite important because the residual charges are based on gross AMD. So there may be some areas where there's small embedded generation that isn't included in the modelling, that isn't visible due to data issues. So there are some areas where the residual charge could be slightly higher than modelled. That's probably more likely to affect smaller organisations. That's quite a few caveats, but overall we believe the charges are quite indicative. Yeah, I mean it may just be smaller lines companies where embedded generation is an issue, or where there's big changes in demand. So if industrials have moved out of an area or into an area, that will obviously have quite a big impact. So just having a look at the overall charges. This graph shows charges by customer group. So the orange is the proposal and the grey is the status quo. And overall, I think they're broadly consistent. You can understand a few differences with South Island generation charges going down due to the HVDC being allocated via the area of benefit charge. And Upper North Island mass market load's gone up, and that's due again to the area of benefit charge, allocating some of those investments more locally. But overall, the charges are relatively similar. In terms of the area of benefit charge, it's interesting to look at the magnitude of the benefits, the raw benefits, compared to the magnitude of the charges. Now the charges are generally, well, for the larger area of benefit charges, they're an order of magnitude smaller than the benefits received. I think that's quite an important thing to keep in mind with the charges. Now, if we think back to 2015 and the options papers, there were two options modelled there, and there was quite a spread in the charges across different parties. Now, so those are the two different options from the 2015 paper, and this is on a household basis.
Thank you. Those actually weren't. This was the base option that was modelled, and so the first of those options, or the first of those bars relates to the initial modelling that was released, and then we released some updated modelling, and that's the second of those bars. So that's the orange bar.
Right. Yeah. Thanks, Alistair. These next two blue and red bars show the current proposal with and without the ACOT payments. And you can see the spread in charges is much lower. Looking at the charges by parties in dollars per megawatt hour basis, you can can get a bit of a feel for the proposal in orange again, status quo in grey. That horizontal dashed line at $20 a megawatt hour is the average EDB charge. And you can see there's about 4 parties, or 4 lines parties that are above that charge for the average EDB charge. And we'll look at that in a minute. So just looking at some of those parties where the charges are quite different. Starting on the left, Electricity Ashburton, there appears to be a very big increase in charges. And that's due to 2 reasons. One is due to load factor. So Electricity Ashburton has a relatively low load factor, but there's also the RCPD effect, going from an RCPD charge for a summer peaking party just to a gross AMD type allocator. So that's basically driven by the residual charge, an increase in residual charges due to a change in the allocator. If we look at the next few, North Power, Top Energy and Vector, that's mainly due to the area of benefit charge. So the charge is allocating more of the investment costs from the Upper North Island to those parties. And for West Power, very similar to Electricity Ashburton, that's an issue of the current charges or residual/interconnection charges being relatively low compared to the new allocator, and also embedded generation issues. So the gross AMD is having an impact there. Kiwi Rail, an interesting one, that's mainly driven by load factor. Charges are actually relatively low in absolute magnitude, but on a dollars per megawatt hour basis, they're very high. This chart shows the impact of the residual charge basically, and how the residual charge is proportionate to load factor. So parties with very high load factor have a very low dollar per megawatt hour residual charge. They're directly in proportion to each other, and that's just the effect of the gross AMD allocator. Any questions on that? Ramu.
Hi there. I just want to know, especially with historical investments, when the counterfactual was set up, like when there's no HVDC, is the assumption still made that the Otahu and Southdown units would have retired with no HVDC?
I don't quite understand your question.
The question was, when doing the historical investments, you'd consider with and without the investment in place. So, for example, if Pole 3 was not commissioned or did not exist, do you assume that Otahu and Southdown would still have retired?
Yeah, so the assumptions of the Rankine units being in and Otahu and Southdown out are applied to all scenarios, and that's just a modelling simplification. I mean, in reality, probably a lot more effort would be put into the counterfactual for that VSPUD modelling, and a lot more detailed scenario would need to be developed, and probably a policy put around how that scenario was developed, because the counterfactual is quite important.
Yeah, if you use the VSPUD method.
Yeah, if you use the VSPUD method.
As Alistair said earlier, there's other options that could be used to determine the area of benefit that Transpower may consider as more appropriate.
That model's based on anytime maximum demand, I understand. How difficult would it be to redo the model based on RCPD demand for the last 5 years?
It's based on an estimate of gross AMD where we had the embedded generation data. It could be. I mean, that can be done.
I think that'd be that'd be a useful thing to do.
Yeah, thank you for that suggestion, Lyndon. I mean, our proposal is that it's based on a measure of physical capacity, but if you think there is a better way that it could be done, then please do, provide that in your submission. So, for example, if that was a historical RCPD, as I think was suggested by James earlier, then we'd welcome that. Hear that in the submission.
I think it'd be useful for everybody to actually see what the difference would be. That would be quite helpful, perhaps prior.
Okay. I mean, we weren't proposing to be releasing any further modelling during the course of this consultation, but we would appreciate any submissions you had. That'd be very helpful.
Alistair, it's not clear that you're probably more of an expert on this, but it's not clear that an RCPD is a good indicator of capacity. Any time maximum demand approach is more consistent with a capacity-based charge. If you look at the options, the sort of options that we consider for the residual, what is any time maximum demand, transformer capacity or lines capacity, I think it would be, I can't see immediately why an RCP-based charge is consistent with capacity. So we'll have to think about that. But you're welcome to put it in your submissions, but I'd be very interested to see how you think that is consistent with a capacity-based approach.
Just to back up that last point about using historic RCPD, I thought, Roger, you made the point it didn't really matter what measure you used as long as it was fixed going forward. I mean, my suggestion was that RCPD would lead to a much lower level of wealth transfer than shifting to AMD.
It's true for the residual. It doesn't actually matter. And as I was saying before, I've got to be careful. It doesn't matter for efficiency, but it obviously matters a hell of a lot for the potential wealth transfers, and therefore for the perceptions of the regime, and therefore its durability, which also goes to efficiency. As I said earlier, if you think we've got that wrong for some reason, or if you think there is a better way of doing it that would add to the durability of the regime, we'd love to hear about it.
Cool, and so my second question was building on Ramu's point. If you're going to be looking at area benefit charges over the lifetime of historic investments that are already there, is it more appropriate to use the information you had at the time the investments were made, or information you've got now? So, for example, NIGUP would look quite different potentially if you use the load forecast we had in 2005, 2006 compared to the ones we have now and the different changes of generation investment that have happened, or divestment.
I can have a go at that. What we're trying to do is forecast the future to determine the area of benefits, and we've got a really good forecast of the past, so it does help to use that.
Sorry, what was that? So it's better to use the information we have now as opposed to what we had at the time?
Yeah, because what we were trying to do at the time was forecast what would happen in the future, and if we did that imperfectly, we can do better by actually using the measure we've got.
Can I just add that, so just to emphasise, so this, firstly, we're not proposing that SPD, VSPD method would be the method, that it's an option for Transpower to consider. So the modelling is based on VSPD. The second thing is we have said, suggested with those historical investments, it would be the area of benefit as determined from 2019. So if it's appropriate to use those generators in that determination, then that would be, that would be something. But that's a matter for Transpower to consider when it considers, when it's doing its development of the TPM, assuming these guidelines are confirmed.
Is it safe to assume that the gross AMD that you're using hasn't considered cogen versus embedded generation, and in fact you have penalised large industrial load by increasing the AMD by adding their cogeneration back on in your modelling?
Well, we certainly haven't penalised anybody. We've used embedded generation data where it's available. Where we didn't have access to that data, we've just read it as a modelling simplification, and hence the caveats on the modelling. It's indicative.
I just wanted to highlight, I think, more how the actual area benefit charges could differ in future from what you've modelled in VSPUD. So, I mean, the example that jumps out at me is the HVDC modelling in 2012. You did what I thought was a pretty thorough piece of work looking at how the grids in both islands would have evolved had we had one pole or two poles with different generation mixtures, and that's what I would anticipate the kind of work that Transpower would do. And that came out with a spread of charges, which I think from memory was roughly sort of about 40% North Island load, 30% South Island generation, and 25% South Island load, for example. Whereas the VSPUD modelling that's done is sort of a 50-50 split between North Island load and South Island generation with nothing to South Island load. So yeah, I just question how much confidence can we have in the modelling results that are a sort of a 1 year snapshot compared to the long-term lifetime investment modelling that Transpower would be required to do.
I mean, your points are entirely valid, but as I say, the modelling is to help people understand the method. It's not to provide the forecast of 2019 charges. That will depend on what the proposal is at the time and how that's put into place.
Can I just add, so that modelling in 2012 wasn't, the modelling here is net benefits, whereas the modelling in 2012 wasn't net benefits, it was benefit. So if a customer had a benefit, such as South Island load, which they would receive a benefit from the HVDC, but in net terms over the lifetime of the investment they didn't receive a benefit, it was effectively a net cost, they wouldn't receive a charge. So the proposal is actually subtly different, and therefore the modelling is different as well. Now, I mean, I think your point's perfectly valid, James, that you would expect a much broader range of scenarios to be modelled. So we've just done some indicative modelling that does have a range of hydro inflows, and you would expect something broader than that, absolutely. But it's just that the modelling itself that was done then was actually modelling a slightly different thing from what the modelling is here.
Can I also comment, and Alistair, you may put me right if I'm wrong here, that when the current TPM was put in place or proposed back in about 2007, 2008, I understand there was no modelling done for that. So I think we're trying to put some modelling out to provide some indicative indications. I think we've done a reasonable job putting out what we think is indicative. And in the past, TPM changes have been made where there's been no modelling put out. Modelling of the type, no change to the guidelines. Actually, I don't think, Jeremy, when you did the operational review last year, which was actually a change to the TPM, Transpower didn't do any indicative modelling, did they? You did you? Okay.
Do you want to just pass around the microphone so that it can be recorded for posterity on YouTube?
So sorry, John, I just said Transpower is required to produce, to model the estimated price effects, accepting that it won't always be possible to do that precisely, and we did do that last year. As it just made the point that the authority is not required to do it, but has opted to do it to help parties understand what I would probably characterise as maybe illustrative rather than indicative. I don't believe it's indicative in any particular way, but I think you've made the point. But it is a distinction. We don't know what the appropriate method will be. We don't know what some of the really high value impacting assumptions and settings will be in that modelling. And I think when we did this work and assist the authority, that was very clear. So it is important to bear that in mind. But that's just that's a statement of fact rather than anything else.
After Transpower developed its methodology and then Transpower is required to submit its proposal to the EA, at what point does Transpower need to consult? Or is there a requirement for Transpower to consult with the industry participants before submitting the proposal to the EA, or does it happen after?
No, there's no requirement for Transpower to consult in the code. There is a requirement for the authority, though, to consult on the TPM that Transpower puts forward. And it's not just with industry participants either, it would be with all stakeholders, so consumers and industry participants.
Just looking at this chart again and the residual charge, the way it'll be allocated out, you've assumed here on the basis of the anytime max demand gross of whatever you can measure, correct?
Correct.
So the alternatives, as we said, are the RCPD, for example, historical or possibly line capacity or possibly transformer capacity. So there's 3 other possible denominators to the equation. Given what you've said, that as far as the policy here is concerned, the denominator doesn't really matter because all you're trying to do is allocate costs in a way that people can't avoid them. Is that correct?
So can I just clarify, Shane? So our proposal is that we're not proposing RCPD, historical RCPD, as an allocator. It could be, but that's not our proposal. So
right, but you've invited people to suggest that as a possibility.
Well, if you think that would be superior to our proposal,
right, well,
then we'd welcome
my point is this, that amongst the many different allocators or denominators you could use,
sure.
You're saying from a policy point of view you're largely neutral because once it's been fixed, people can't avoid the charge.
Sure.
And that's sufficient under your
sure, but our proposal is physical capacity using those 3 possible measures. So
well, which of the 3 is your proposal?
So no, well that would be for Transpower to determine which best promoted the statutory objective.
Okay, but you've shown charts and results based only on
one of them. That's
gross
right.
anytime
yep,
max
so
demand.
that's so that it's providing an indication. Yep.
So in terms of getting feedback on your proposal, do you expect anything other than self-interest to prevail and that people are going to want to know exactly what the impact is on their particular wealth gain or loss before they feed back to you what they think is a good idea?
Well, so what we would certainly what we'd really welcome is feedback that a particular approach best promotes the statutory objective, because that's all we can make, or the board can make its decisions on. Self-interest certainly makes perfect sense to a party, but that's not a matter we can take into account. So we want feedback on if a particular approach best promotes the statutory objective.
But you yourselves have concluded, am I right, that the particular allocator doesn't make any difference to a statutory objective because they're all going to be efficient, because they're all unavoidable?
I would have thought from the benefit side, yes, but there's also a cost associated with coming up with these charges. So the administrative costs and implementation costs would be something that you would have consideration to.
A relatively minor consideration, I'd suggest, for anybody feeding back.
And as I said, that's from a narrow interpretation of efficiency. If you take a broader one, including how durable the regime is, and therefore how certain the future charges are going to be, that is also going to affect efficiency.
We've still got the CBA to discuss. Is there any further? Did you have no further slides? So unless there's a burning question on the modelling, I'd like to move on to the CBA. Thanks very much.
Are they going to stay there? Thanks for having me over here on the other side of the ditch. Today I'm going to present about 5 or 6 slides just to give some context to Oakley Greenwood's participation in the whole TPM process. Firstly, I'll just provide a bit of background to OGW, so a couple of minutes spiel, advertisement, some might suggest. I'll talk about the basis for developing the CBA. So this is really talking about the principles, the key principles that we've given consideration to when undertaking this piece of advice. I'll talk to the key benefits that we've modelled. This is probably the most important thing that, from your perspective, what benefits have we modelled and how have we modelled them. And lastly, I'll talk about some of the unquantified benefits. So obviously in doing a CBA, it can be a fairly complex task, lots of assumptions as well, and in some cases we've formed the view that we can't reasonably quantify some of the benefits associated with the TPM proposal. However, we have tried to, as much as possible, identify those benefits in a qualitative fashion and describe why we think they are benefits as well. You're right, it is a bit sticky, isn't it? In terms of my 2-minute spiel on OGW, we were established back in 2008 when I wasn't there, but it was established by three people, Greg Thorpe, Lance Hodge and Jim Snow. They came out of Charles Rivers Associates. I'm not sure
whether any of you know of them or Charles Rivers Associates, but that's where they've come out of. Predominantly an energy consulting firm, but also do water work. Now I've got 13 consultants. We do a lot of work within Australia, obviously, but also do a fair amount of international work, obviously in New Zealand, Hong Kong, Singapore, and a number of other places. I think the important thing in the background that I wanted to highlight was the skill set within OGW that's been brought to this particular task. Obviously there's economic skill sets. I'm an economist by trade, but we've also got engineering skill sets, regulatory and governance skill sets, but particularly the economic and engineering skill sets have been brought to the table with regards to this assignment. In terms of relevant experience, I won't go through the full list of our relevant experience, but just I wanted to highlight a couple of examples of where we've used these types of skills. So we've designed the first dynamic peak price operated by a distribution business in Australia. I actually did this when I was working for SP AusNet, now called AusNet Services. That's critical peak demand tariff. We advise 5 or 6 distribution businesses over the last probably 18 months with regards to tariff strategy and tariff design. There's been, if anyone follows the Australian market, there's been significant changes to the national electricity rules with regards to how distribution businesses must develop their distribution prices, their DUOS prices. There's been very much a focus on moving towards more cost-reflective distribution charges. So we've done a lot of work in that space over the last 18 months. We undertook a CBA for a large policy change that came out of the Department of Infrastructure. This was the potential introduction of a demand response mechanism within the national electricity market. We've done various CBAs on AMI-related infrastructure, which lots of consultants have. The basis for developing the cost-benefit analysis. So this is really some of the key principles that we've had regard to. These are pretty sort of stock standard, but for certainty, I just wanted to step through them. So really, the first port of call is we're just testing whether the benefits of EA's proposal outweighs the costs associated with delivering upon that proposal. So obviously, we're considering the benefits of the TPM and we're considering the costs of those changes. But those benefits and costs are relative to a base case, and that's the current TPM, including Transpower's 2015 review, the results of that. Obviously, as I've spoken about before, the benefits can be both quantified as well as being described qualitatively, and we've mixed and matched. We've got a couple of both. Obviously, we're modelling the benefits and the costs over an extended period of time. So the base case is done over a 20-year period. We've also tested the sensitivity of that to changes in the evaluation period, so 10 years and 30 years, as well as changes in other parameters like the weighted average cost of capital, changes in the cost of implementing, changes in the amount of capital expenditure that will be priced by the area of benefit charge and the deeper connection charge, because we were tasked with doing the CBA on that as well. So in short, the modelling is done over an extended period, and there's a number of sensitivities which are outlined in our paper, as you will have seen if you've read it. Probably the most important slide that I'll go through today, and that is, well, what are the key benefits that we modelled in our CBA, we quantified? The first is future investment in services or equipment that may otherwise be a substitute for a transmission service. So our assumption in thinking that that is a benefit and quantifying that is that if you send a more cost-reflective transmission price signal, that could theoretically incentivise an investment in an alternative to a transmission investment in the short or the long term. So this could be things around demand response. So if I send a price signal around transmission, then that may incentivise demand response. If demand response is cheaper than the transmission cost, it could be that if I send a price signal around transmission, that I might get an investment in a distributed generator instead of, or in lieu of, having to build the transmission asset. And in the context of the short-term versus the long-term analysis, as I think I sort of spoke to before, one of the things that we've relied upon is to estimate the long-run marginal cost as a proxy for the the area of benefit charge. So that's effectively looking at the longer term. We've also looked at the potential to use distributed generation to defer transmission investment. So this is a sort of a short-term price signal. Can I use distributed generation, defer a transmission investment by a year or two, and is that an economic outcome? So our modelling has addressed that and looked into that. And this is mainly because in Australia, we've seen that as a potential alternative in a number of different circumstances and situations. We've put a case study in the CBA if you're interested. The second benefit, I should say, that we looked at was around co-optimising future investment in electricity generation and transmission services. So again, our assumption, looking at the TPM proposal, was that both of the transmission options, that being the area of benefit charge and the deeper connection charge, signal the costs of some future investments that are deeper into the grid. They're signalling that cost to generators, and if generators see that price signal, then that incentivises them to basically co-optimise the costs of building their generating unit and the transmission costs as well. So they're looking at both of those price signals and saying, well, what's the optimum? What's the economic outcome? So we've modelled that. That's been included as a benefit in our CBA. The third one, and this topic has come up a fair bit throughout the discussion so far, and that's around how historical investments are priced. As I've laboured, I think, a couple of times, and Roger's spoken to a number of times, I mean, the pricing of historical investments can lead to economically inefficient outcomes if they distort future consumption behaviour or if they lead to inefficient connection or disconnection decisions. So this is the concept of pricing between standalone and avoidable cost. So this efficient pricing band, that's particularly important, and also this disassociating the price signal from the cost recovery. So we don't want to have a price signal that is based on megawatt hours or peak demand if it's being used to recover a sunk investment, because the cost of that sunk investment or that historical investment can't be changed because of that consumer's response to that particular price signal. So that's an important feature of our CBA, and that particularly comes through in the modelling of the RCPD charge and what that's incentivising, and whether what it's incentivising is actually efficient relative to the alternative being to just build the transmission asset. And now that's not to say that we're favouring the transmission asset or anything like that, but that's meant to represent the price signal that comes through the TPM, and if there's an efficient alternative to that transmission asset, then that's what you want to incentivise through the price signal. And the last one I think I spoke to earlier on in the day in response to a question, and that was around more efficient quantity of transmission and generation services being demanded by the market. Effectively, our premise or our assumption is that if you've got a cost-reflective transmission price signal and businesses see that cost-reflective transmission price signal, then they will flow that through to end retail prices, in particular into the variable component, which is what customers can respond to. They can change their behaviour. They can consume less overall, or they can consume less during peak periods. That quantity impacts on peak demand. Peak demand is a driver of transmission investment. That impacts on the costs associated with that as well. I want to stop there and ask, do people have any questions around these four benefits and our modelling of these four benefits?
Hi, I'm Mary Ann from Pioneer Energy. In the estimate of the benefit from removing the RCPD charge, talk about 100 pricing periods, and then in the model use the number 200. I'm just not sure.
Yeah, that's because we've assumed that to hit the 100 you've got to operate for 200. It's because they don't know in advance exactly which of the 100 pricing periods that will form the basis of the RCPD charge. So given that, one assumes that you've got to operate for more than 100 to actually hit the 100. And as the load duration curve changes, as it becomes flatter at the top end, you're probably going to have to operate for even more than 200. So that's why we've capped that as well.
Hi, Jonathan from Pioneer Energy. So the
the RCPD benefit is a significant benefit, and it's almost entirely premised on future generation being diesel.
Yep.
Now, in your own cost-benefit analysis, you conclude that existing DG provides a positive benefit.
Yes.
And I guess I'm just interested to know, firstly, whether any consideration was given to that precedent of existing renewable generation and its LRMC, and what the impact would have been of having that as the assumption moving forward, or at least a comparable basket to the existing precedent, as opposed to fully diesel-based generation?
No, we didn't model that. The assumption with that one was that you've basically exhausted all of this cheap embedded generation, and that going forward, the maintenance of the retention of the RCPD charge will incentivise more expensive embedded generation. And what we've modelled is a diesel generator. And so what happens is that the RCPD charge basically sits above the cost of the diesel generator, but unfortunately the diesel generator sits above the transmission cost.
Yeah, so that just to follow that up, that assumption that we've exhausted the existing resource, or that resource has been exhausted, is obviously very fundamental, and I was just wondering where that assumption or what evidence that assumption has been based on.
Look, I can't point to any specific document, but what I would say is that if there is cheap embedded generation that is still out there in the market that is yet to be monetised, for want of a better term, then the area of benefit charge would incentivise that as well. Because the area of benefit charge is basically, the way we've modelled it, is it would be analogous or a proxy for the long-run marginal cost, or I should say the long-run marginal cost in our modelling is a proxy for the area of benefit price signal. And so if this unutilised or undeveloped embedded generation resource is still out there, then that would be incentivised through that area of benefit charge.
Can I just add to that? The purpose of having service-based and cost-reflective pricing of transmission is precisely to make sure that if investment in DG or DR is efficient, it happens, and if it's inefficient, it doesn't happen.
So I think I agree and accept your point in relation to the RCPD charge. In fact, in our modelling, assuming that the RCPD charge basically goes from that charge to effectively like a fixed charge, that imposes benefits effectively, because you're not getting that future diesel generation being built. But in the modelling, you'll see that there's actually a cost associated with it as well, and that is if you had no charge, then existing DG wouldn't operate, because there'd be no price signal whatsoever. However, the counterpoint to that is that in place of it will be an area of benefit charge, which will be a forward-looking price signal around the cost of future transmission investments, and then that will be the price signal that will incentivise all of this cheap embedded generation that is out there in the market that it hasn't yet been developed. Does that make sense? Because that's a really important point around the price signals, and in that context we're talking about changing from an RCPD price signal and removing that to a forward-looking area of benefit price signal in terms of our modelling, and that in that context what you said would incentivise that cheap embedded generation coming on.
The avoidance of
that? Yes, well, not the avoidance of the cheap generation.
The avoidance of the area.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right.
Yeah, I'm not clear how you benefit from that, but I get your.
I don't know how to capture that benefit, but I can understand how the benefit exists.
Are you talking about in practice how you capture that benefit?
Yes.
Well, I think that goes to Alistair's description of the area of benefit charge and how that would be signalled in advance of the investment that's required by Transpower, and that would be basically the signal to the market to go and say, okay, there's an investment over here, it's bespoke, it's in this area, what can I do to offset the need for that investment?
Yeah,
Sorry,
I was just going to say,
Jonathan.
I'll give you the benefit of some of your economic theory in terms of your explanation, but I guess the simple fact is if I change the assumption of your cost-benefit analysis to a more sensible LRMC for distributed generation, you get a significantly different outcome from your analysis.
Yeah, I won't.
I'm not quite sure how you get to that conclusion because you would get the efficient generation being under the RCPD charge. You get the efficient generation, and you also get the inefficient generation.
And under the area of benefit charge that effectively replaces it, you'll just get the efficient generation. I completely agree that as soon as you change one assumption in any model, it will always change the result. So, and there are some that are particularly important, some that are not particularly important. I mean, I'd be interested to see your responses to the issues paper around the long-run marginal cost of diesel generation.
The area of net present value there, the 89.9 million, replacement of the RCPD demand with a charge based on physical capacity.
Yes.
Would that, in a broader sense, be more characterised by a charge based on historical fixed charges rather than in particular physical capacity?
The physical capacity is important in my little brain because it means that this is based on historical physical capacity, so it can't be changed. So whatever I do in the future can't change what's already there. So
So the point is any charge based on historical capacity that can't be changed.
Yes.
Applies in this case. So
Yes.
that's just one particular aspect or one way to do that. That saving would apply to any way of achieving that.
Yep, as long as it's fixed.
With respect to that benefit, although as Roger has alluded to, there are durability issues with respect to the charge based on historical capacity. And are you going to talk to those sort of issues shortly, or that? No, not. But that's another point. So we do think there are durability issues, which, are as Roger said, affect efficiency as well.
So if there's no more questions, I can go. Oh, we have. Sorry.
So just to that point, if you reprice the historic assets in any way and then fixed it, it wouldn't change any of those numbers up there?
Unless we believed
apart from durability?
Unless we believed it was going to distort future consumption or investment behaviour. So if you came up with a methodology to price historic assets that led to a whole raft of customers being incentivised to inefficiently disconnect from the grid, then that has an economic impact, and that would be quantified. So part of the reason why we don't think that's a likely outcome is if you're using things like area of benefit and historic cost, things like that, that you're mitigating the risk that you're disassociating a customer's overall bill, not just their variable charge, but their overall bill from the actual costs of getting them supply. So in that context, we don't think that there's a large risk that suddenly you're going to incentivise, a big rump of your customer base to inefficiently disconnect from the grid. But notwithstanding that, the counterpoint or the protection mechanism there is the PDP, because if you have created a pricing signal that leads to that, then the PDP should kick in. I mean, that's the purpose of the PDP, is to mitigate the risk that you're going to get these inefficient disconnections from the grid because of the way you've structured prices. I mean, this is a real living or live example in distribution land where you've got PV, and I can't speak for what's happening over here in New Zealand, but in Australia there's significant penetration of PV systems, and then you've got the sort of the forecast of what's going to happen with battery systems coming in. And so everyone's talking about not only what the price signal has driven the PV systems in the first place, but when people get a PV system and a battery system, might they disconnect from the grid? And so distribution businesses are sitting there and thinking, well, how do I price these customers to make sure that they aren't inefficiently incentivised to leave the grid because of the fact that they've now got a PV and battery system? So that's changing the way certain customer classes are being priced from a distribution business perspective. But the same principles apply for transmission as well.
Can I just add a point about the policy design, which is that we're not trying to design this to maximise use of the prudent discount policy. We want to minimise the use of the prudent discount policy, because every time you give it, it means somebody else has to pay more. And so we want to get an allocator that doesn't encourage people to disconnect from the grid.
Yeah, my comment shouldn't have been taken as that.
Look, I think we better move on and have Roger's just going to put up a few...
I'll just talk to
another
the
slide, sorry.
But wait, there's more.
There's more!
This is my last slide anyway, so that's fine. So as I said, we've quantified a number of benefits. There are a number of unquantified benefits as well, which Roger will sort of respond to from EA's perspective. But I mean, the key one that was identified is around additional scrutiny, in particular the greater incentive, the fact that the price signal might incentivise customers to reveal their willingness to pay for certain services provided by Transpower during the regulatory process. That's likely to be one of the benefits that comes through from the TPM, and sending those cost-reflective price signals to the broader customer base, getting them to reveal their willingness to pay, because they will actually be subjected to that price increase if that investment occurs, unlike what happens now. The other ones that we haven't quantified, but that we think are reasonable, is around the area of benefit charge and its structure, and this is relative to the deeper connection charge. Alistair spoke about the marginal cost adjustment. I think you termed it. I've termed it sort of a two-part fixed variable tariff. But that marginal cost adjustment is a really important feature of the area of benefit charge. That's sending a marginal price signal to the market to incentivise those efficient investments in distributed generation, demand response, etc., etc. If absent that, the area of benefit charge would be sending what is effectively kind of an average cost of an asset to the market. Now, because of the scale efficiency benefits of transmission investments, that's a particularly important issue. As Roger, I think, said earlier, if you had constant returns to scale, then they'd be the same. So you wouldn't have to do it. But that's not the case in the context of a transmission investment. So that's a feature that we think is really important of the area of benefit charge. These are probably not that important, the last two, because they relate to the deeper connection charge, but just for completeness, I'll talk to them. The deeper connection charge is, from an economic perspective, slightly flawed because it's based on a 5-year rolling average of flows. What that does is effectively creates a per megawatt charge, but it's actually a per megawatt charge that's designed to recover a historical investment. So you can't change those costs. So that actually has some negative efficiency properties, and also the deeper connection charge may, in theory, create a locational distortion as well. Thank you.
Yeah, Roger, look, I must apologise. I omitted to introduce Roger. As you get up, Roger. So Roger, you probably guessed, is an economist. He's a very good economist. He used to be a senior manager at Treasury, and prior to assisting the authority on contract, I think you're joining the authority soon. Prior to that, he was the chief economist or was it principal economist? I think it was chief economist at MB, Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. So I'll pass it over to Roger.
Sorry, I've gone 2 slides forward.
You've got to press it really hard, Roger.
Yeah. Okay. The Oakley Greenwood analysis is an independent analysis, so there's some things we don't agree with it and our full views are set out in Chapter 8 of the second issues paper. But we do think it provides a reasonable assessment of the benefits and costs that it quantifies. There's obviously a lot of professional judgment involved in that, and so different modellers would get to different numbers. But the important point about that is the OGW did reasonably extensive sensitivity analysis, and from that you can deduce that the benefits would be positive and substantial under any reasonable assumptions that you could make for the analysis. We also think the unquantified benefits are likely to be very substantial and larger than are implied by the OGW sensitivity analysis. So I'll just go into that a bit more. They include the improved scrutiny of proposed transmission investment and and replacement expenditure, so it's both new and replacement. And the point of the proposal is that those who are benefiting are going to pay the full cost, and others are going to pay nothing, which means that those who are benefiting have real skin in the game in terms of the incentive to engage and to see that the right decision is made. And they will therefore provide information to Transpower if they think Transpower is getting it wrong. They have an incentive to support efficient investments, and they have an incentive to oppose inefficient incentives because the benefits they get are less than the costs. And so we expect to see better specification and timing of investment. So that's probably a key benefit. A second one is the reduced cost of unproductive disputes. Service-based prices and cost-reflective prices are normally seen as fair. People don't expect to pay for something that's going to benefit somebody else and not benefit them. They typically think it reasonable that if they're going to get a benefit from something, that they should pay a cost that is less than that benefit. And so that we think is going to make the TPM more durable, and that durability in turn means that people will have better confidence about what their charges will be in future, which will improve certainty and therefore in effect reduce their WACC for investment decisions. We also think there's a benefit of potential customers not being inefficiently encouraged or discouraged about entering the market. And by way of example, some transmission customers are in effect paying nothing for access to transmission services at the moment, which is clearly inefficient. And the last benefit I want to highlight is that the modelling that Rohan presented is done over 20 years, and we know that transmission investments are typically much longer lived than that, and so that the sensitivity analysis that they did showed that increasing the life to 30 years increases the benefits substantially, and it's obviously longer than that again. So overall, the authority's view is that these unquantified benefits are large, and probably large enough, almost certainly large enough on their own to justify the proposal, even if the quantified benefits were nothing.
Any questions on that?
You've stated that the first item of the above is the most significant benefit, and but the area of benefit charges deviates from the, or at least conventional and widely accepted method of long-run marginal cost pricing. It doesn't fully or correctly signal the cost of the future cost of the upgrades. We all discussed that.
Let me give you an example.
If you're a range of historical assets, and if Oakley Greenwood does the CBA in Australia or in the UK, they would find that moving to RCBD regime would actually have positive benefit rather than negative benefit. But I accepted that we have a particular situation here. We have a particular situation where we have made investment, which we have plenty of excess capacity in many parts of the market. And but this is a situation that is common, and whatever you come up with here, that to provide a transition, it will be very useful for other regulators around the world to copy. But it is a situation that, that's why I'm saying that you're looking at the 30-year period, but within that 30-year period, there will be the need for proper signals of the cost of upgrade, which means that you will be moving back towards the long-run marginal cost regimes, and therefore I think it would be good to have a recognition in that. You actually have a recognition in that by including the marginal cost, but again, it's more like an add-on rather than a structural recognition that at some stage within the 30 years that you come back to that kind of regime. Thank you.
I have to say I don't agree. If you look at Chapter 5 of the document, we've laid out very clearly why we think the logic of what we're doing is right. And if you disagree, we'd welcome submissions on why that might not be the case. To give you an example, when we've got a connection asset, should we be charging for the cost of that connection asset, for the use of that connection asset, for access to that connection asset, on the basis of its cost or on the basis of its peak demand? And my answer would be we should be charging on the basis of its cost. In every other market that you look at, like the market for cars, for example, we charge on the basis of costs, and customers are sufficiently forward-looking that they can work out whether the cost of the asset is worth the benefit. So we're charging two things. One is the cost of the asset, which we're collecting over the life of the asset, and the second is the use of the asset. We think it's right for car owners to pay for the petrol that they use in their car, and we're charging that through the nodal price. So I disagree with your analysis, but as I say, this is a proposal. It's based on a logic of intervention, and if you would like to, if you disagree with that, we'd like to hear about that in submissions.
Mickey Cave, Transpower. Just to point out that when we do allocate the costs of shared connection assets, we do allocate based on demand. So I think the situation here is connection assets are identifiable to connection users, and then all the problems start when you have shared assets amongst multiple users. So they're not really talking about the same thing.
Yeah, I agree. As the proposal notes, that there is a good reason to allocate on the basis of benefits, but when there's more than one user of an asset, it's quite difficult to estimate relative benefits, and if it is effectively impractical, then you have to go for a proxy for that, and use is one proxy.
Sorry, maybe this was covered in an earlier slide or not, I'm not sure. But do you know what the additional benefits are of applying the AOB to historical investments?
The advantage is not so much in the advantage is not so much as in applying the AOB to historical investments as removing the RCPD from historical investments. The issue with charging for historical investments goes more to the durability of the regime. It's very predictable that if we asked customers in the rest of New Zealand to pay for Auckland's assets through the current charges, and to pay for their own assets, and in addition, they would ask why they are being charged for the Auckland assets, and quite justifiably.
Look, the last slide is just next steps. I think obviously the first next step, we've released the consultation paper. This is actually next steps, not just for the TPM, it's also for the related distributed generation pricing principles paper. So consultation is due to close on 26th of July. And I think I don't really need to go through the rest of these steps. We've covered that in quite a lot of detail today with the various questions that you've raised. So I just wanted to emphasise that the slides will be made available on our web under our TPM page, So the slides are available. We're having 2 more workshops, one tomorrow in Invercargill and the following day in Christchurch. So you're welcome to attend those or to get representatives from your companies to attend those as well. So look, I just wanted to thank you for today. I mean, I found it a very engaging and entertaining session. Yesterday's was also very engaging, and I really appreciate your interaction and asking lots of good questions, and I very strongly encourage you to make submissions on the TPM and if you're interested as well on the DGPP. So thank you very much.